The first time I noticed it, I was halfway through eating dinner. I had been cutting into a piece of chicken when I glanced at my plate and realized I had already cut that exact piece in half. I blinked, confused, my fork hovering mid-air. The shape of the cut, the angle of the knife. Everything was identical to the memory in my head, except I hadn't actually taken a bite yet. I let it go, convincing myself I must have just imagined it. Stress did weird things to your mind. The second time, I couldn't explain away so easily. I was walking through the park, heading home from work, when I saw a man sitting on a bench reading a newspaper. Nothing unusual about him. Gray sweater, glasses, a neatly trimmed beard. About 5 minutes later, I passed the same man again, on the same bench, in the exact same position. His paper was folded the same way, his left leg crossed over his right. I stopped, pretending to tie my shoe while I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't move, not even to turn the page. It wasn't déjà vu. I was certain I just walked past him. As I kept walking, I turned around once more. The bench was empty. The world began to fray in ways I couldn't ignore. My coffee cup, always kept on the right side of my desk, started appearing on the left. A text message I'd already sent appeared in my drafts folder, unsent. A stranger on the subway sat in one seat, then a moment later, sat again in another, as if he had jumped between them without standing up. It wasn't just odd. It felt deliberate, like reality itself was adjusting around me. One night, I went out for a late walk to clear my head. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing in the distance. As I turned a corner, I saw something strange. A woman standing perfectly still under a street lamp, staring straight ahead. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes didn't blink. I slowed my pace, unsure if I should approach. When I got closer, I noticed something even stranger. Her hands, which were clasped in front of her, were trembling slightly, but not like normal human movement. They were vibrating, almost imperceptibly, at an unnatural frequency, like a glitching animation. I felt the urge to call out to her, but I didn't. Something about her presence made my skin crawl, like she wasn't really there, like she was a projection waiting for a command. When I passed her, she turned her head slightly, just enough to follow me with her gaze. After that night, the distortions became more blatant. The traffic outside my apartment window started looping. The same cars would pass by every 3 minutes, in the same sequence, down to the honk of a horn and a man yelling at a dog. A pigeon on the fire escape appeared at 7:05 every morning, always landing on the same spot, always tilting its head at the exact same angle. I even tested it once, throwing a piece of bread onto the ledge. The pigeon ignored it, as though the bread wasn't part of its programming. I started keeping a journal, trying to document every anomaly I encountered. Writing helped at first, giving me a sense of control, a way to organize the chaos. But soon, even my notes began to betray me. One night, I flipped back through my entries only to find entire pages blank where I was sure I had written before. Words rearranged themselves. A sentence I had written about the park bench now described a duplicate cat I had never seen. The breaking point came at work. I was in the middle of a meeting, sitting at the conference table, when I noticed the clock on the wall wasn't moving. The second hand was stuck at 12, frozen in place. I nudged my coworker, Amy, to point it out, but she didn't respond. Her face was frozen in mid-laugh, her mouth half open as if caught in a photograph. I stood up, heart pounding. Around me, everyone was still. No breathing, no blinking. Even the coffee in someone's cup was suspended mid-pour. The room felt heavy, like the air had thickened into molasses. "Hello?" I said, my voice cracking. The sound didn't echo. It just disappeared, swallowed by the silence. I turned back toward the door, planning to leave, but when I opened it, the hallway outside wasn't there. Instead, it was my bedroom. My bed, my dresser, the pile of laundry I hadn't folded yet, all exactly as I had left them that morning. I stepped through, my legs trembling, and the door clicked shut behind me. When I turned to look back, it wasn't my office anymore, just another wall. For a long time, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands. If the world could rearrange itself so casually, could I trust that anything I remembered was real? Then I heard it. a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from my closet. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't bear it any longer. Slowly, I walked to the closet door and opened it. Inside was me, not a mirror. Another me. Same face, same clothes, same terrified expression. I stared back, trembling. Then, the other me said, "You're not supposed to see this." I slammed the door shut and stumbled backward. My head spun, my vision blurring. When I opened my eyes again, the closet was gone. Just a blank wall where it had been. The glitches haven't stopped since. If anything, they've become more frequent. Some days, I hear footsteps behind me, but when I turn, there's no one there. Other days, I catch glimpses of myself in reflections that aren't there when I look again. I don't know if the world is breaking, or if it's trying to fix itself. And the worst part? I've stopped questioning it. Because no matter how fractured reality becomes, it continues, relentless and indifferent. Maybe it doesn't matter if the world is fake, as long as it keeps pretending to be real. I found the first one at the edge of the woods behind my house. It was the size of a grapefruit, perfectly round, and covered in what looked like coarse, gray fur. At first, I thought it was an animal, some weird woodland creature curled up in the cold. But when I nudged it with my foot, it didn't move. It didn't even feel alive. The fur was stiff and brittle, like dried grass, and the thing itself was heavier than it looked, dense as a rock. I didn't know what to do with it, so I left it there. I told myself it was probably just a fungal growth, or some bizarre plant the woods had spat out. But that night, as I sat on my porch smoking a cigarette, I noticed something. The thing, whatever it was closer to the house. Not much, maybe a foot or two, but definitely closer than where I'd left it. I should have been unnerved, but curiosity won out. I grabbed a flashlight and walked out to it. The beam revealed no tracks in the dirt, no signs of it being dragged or rolled. I tapped it again with my foot, half expecting it to lurch or scuttle away. Nothing, just that strange, lifeless weight. The next morning, it was on my porch. It sat there like it belonged, perched neatly on the second step. I stared at it for a long time, a sour taste rising in the back of my throat. Part of me wanted to pick it up and throw it back into the woods, but a deeper, more primal instinct screamed at me not to touch it. I grabbed a broom instead, sweeping it down the steps and into the yard. It rolled a few feet, then stopped. I thought that was the end of it. By the following morning, there were two. The second one was identical to the first. Same size, same coarse fur, same impossible weight. They sat side by side on the porch like two waiting dogs. I stared at them, my pulse pounding in my ears. I swept them both off the porch, harder this time, sending them tumbling into the grass. I didn't care where they landed. I just wanted them gone. But they came back. The next day, there were 5. By now, I was out of ideas. I called my friend Darren, who was one of those outdoorsy types who could identify animal tracks and tell you which mushrooms wouldn't kill you. He showed up with a backpack full of gear and a skeptical look on his face. "Probably some kind of seed pod," he said, crouching to inspect the nearest one. He poked it with a gloved finger, then picked it up, his brow furrowing. "Weird, though. Heavy as hell." "Seed pods don't move on their own," I said, arms crossed. Darren shrugged. "Maybe wind. Or animals. You sure you're not just, overthinking this?" "I'm not overthinking it, Darren. They keep coming back." He chuckled, but his smile faded when he looked at my face. All right. I'll take one. See if I can figure out what it is." He left with the smallest one stuffed into a plastic bag. I watched him drive off, part of me relieved to have at least one of them gone. That night, I slept better than I had in days. Until I woke up to the sound. It was faint at first, a low, hollow hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I lay there, heart hammering, as it grew louder. It wasn't coming from inside the house, but outside, right beneath my window. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I pulled back the curtain. They were everywhere. Dozens of them, scattered across the yard like stones in a river. Some were clustered in tight little groups, others spaced out, but all of them were pointed toward the house, toward me. And they were moving. not rolling or crawling, but pulsing, like they were breathing. I stumbled back from the window, while rising in my throat. My phone was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, dialing Darren's number with shaking hands. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. The next day, Darren's car was found on the side of a dirt road 5 miles from my house. The driver's door was open, his backpack still in the passenger seat. The bag he'd taken the thing in was empty, and Darren was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The hum returned, louder now, filling the air like a swarm of bees. The things had multiplied again, spreading across the yard, up the porch steps, onto the roof. Their pulsing grew faster, more frantic, and the hum seemed to sync with it, rising and falling like a living heartbeat. I tried leaving. I threw a bag in my car and peeled out of the driveway, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. But I didn't make it far. The road was blocked by more of them. Hundreds, maybe thousands, stretched out in a carpet that swallowed the pavement. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding to a stop just inches from the nearest one. I couldn't bring myself to drive over them. When I got home, I locked every door, closed every window, and waited. For what? I didn't know. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my teeth. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. It wasn't just a sound. It was inside me, resonating in my bones. And then it stopped. The silence was worse. I opened my eyes to find them inside. They were everywhere, on the furniture, the counters, the floor. Closed now, so close I could see the strands of fur twitching, the tiny, rhythmic pulses that matched the beat of my heart. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The largest one began to split. Slowly, like a flower blooming, its surface peeled back to reveal something wet and glistening inside. A single, unblinking eye stared up at me, its iris the color of an overcast sky. And then I understood. They weren't moving closer. I was moving to them. The first time I noticed something was off, it felt so trivial that I almost didn't think about it at all. I was making breakfast, coffee brewing, toast in the toaster, when I turned to grab the butter from the fridge, except it wasn't in its usual spot on the door shelf. Instead, it was sitting on the counter next to the sink, a perfect square of condensation forming beneath it. I stood there for a moment, trying to reconstruct the sequence of my own movements. Had I taken it out earlier? If so, why put it there instead of where I'd been working? My morning autopilot must have gotten scrambled. Sleep deprivation does weird things to you. But over the next few days, other little moments like that started stacking up. A glass that wasn't where I'd left it. A book that I didn't remember pulling from the shelf, sitting open on the couch. The thermostat turned to a setting I never used. Small things, too small to feel sinister, but enough to leave me with the gnawing sense of being out of step with my own life. It wasn't until the picture changed that I stopped being able to explain it away. There's a photo hanging in my living room, a black and white image of my grandparents on their wedding day. They look young and impossibly elegant, my grandmother's lace veil billowing in a breeze that gives the photo a dreamlike quality. I've always loved that picture, always been comforted by its presence. One night, as I was tidying up the living room, I glanced at the photo and froze. It wasn't my grandparents anymore. The figures in the photo were still dressed in wedding attire, still posed in the same spot under the same tree. But the faces were different, strangers, with sharp, angular features and pale, almost translucent skin. The woman's veil still fluttered in the breeze, but now it looked less like lace and more like cobwebs. I stared at the picture for what felt like an hour, heart pounding. My mind raced through possibilities. A cruel prank, a trick of the light, some kind of mental lapse. But when I reached out to touch the glass, the cool solidity of it confirmed what my eyes already knew. The picture was real. I left the living room that night without turning off the lights. By the time I dared look at the photo again the next day, it had changed back. My grandparents smiled at me with their familiar faces, oblivious to my unease. I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, a moment of sleep deprivation bleeding into waking life. But I couldn't shake the way the strangers in the photo had looked at me, their eyes sharp and knowing, as though they'd been waiting for me to notice them. After that, the small things became bigger. The kitchen light flickered once, and when it steadied, the walls seemed a shade darker than before. My phone's lock screen, normally a picture of my dog, briefly showed something else, a dark, blurry figure standing in a field. When I blinked, it was gone. And the sounds, at first, they were subtle. A faint tapping in the walls, a low hum that seemed to come from nowhere in particular. Then, one night, as I lay in bed with the covers pulled tight around me, I heard something unmistakable, a voice. It wasn't loud, more like a whisper that had accidentally been amplified, but it was clear enough to make my blood run cold. "Are you still there?" I didn't answer. Over the next few nights, the voice came back, always the same question, always in that same breathy, almost curious tone. "Are you still there?" It didn't seem to matter if I had music playing, or if I turned on every light in the house. The voice found me regardless, slipping into the quiet spaces like water through cracks in a dam. I stopped sleeping. I stopped leaving the house except for work, and even there, I began noticing strange little moments. Coworkers staring at me for just a second too long before glancing away. A cup of coffee placed on my desk that no one claimed to have brought. My name, whispered faintly, just on the edge of hearing. I began avoiding mirrors. It wasn't that I'd seen anything unusual in them. At least, not yet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I caught my reflection, I felt a prickle of unease, like I was being studied from the other side. Then, one night, I woke to find the mirror in my bedroom cracked. The fracture ran straight through my reflection's eye, splitting it into two distorted halves. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my throat, until I realized something that made my stomach lurch. The reflection wasn't moving. I stepped closer, my own face staring back at me, motionless and fixed. I raised a trembling hand to touch the glass, and as I did, my reflection finally moved, but not to match me. It smiled. I fled the apartment that night, throwing on a coat and running barefoot to my car. I drove with no destination in mind, just a frantic need to get away, but every street seemed to loop back on itself. The city was unfamiliar in the dark, the streetlights casting strange, fractured shadows that seemed to follow me. When I finally stopped the car, I found myself in front of a diner I didn't recognize. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly blue glow over the parking lot. I stepped inside, desperate for the comfort of other people, but the place was empty except for a single figure seated at the counter. They didn't look up as I approached, their head bent low over a cup of coffee. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking. The figure turned, and my words died in my throat. It was me, or something that looked like me. Its features were all wrong, subtly stretched and distorted, like a reflection in rippling water. It smiled, wide and unnatural, and gestured to the empty seat beside it. "Are you still there?" it asked. I don't know how I made it back home. The next thing I remember, I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the crack in the mirror. The voice hasn't come back. The photo hasn't changed again. But now, when I pass a reflective surface, I don't look away fast enough. I can feel it watching me, waiting for the moment I'll stop pretending I don't see it. I keep wondering what will happen when I finally answer its question. I was standing at the checkout counter of the corner store when the cashier handed me my receipt. It was printed on pale yellow paper instead of the usual white. I almost didn't notice, but something about the faint lemony shade tugged at me. I turned it over in my hand. The ink was smudged, like it had been printed in a hurry, and instead of the usual "thank you for shopping with us," at the bottom, there was a single word, "Wait." I blinked. "What's this about?" I asked, holding it up to the cashier. She didn't even glance at it, busy swiping the next customer's loaf of bread across the scanner. "What's what?" she asked without looking up. "This," I said, but when I glanced down, the receipt was perfectly normal again. White paper, cheerful sign-off. I crumpled it and shoved it into my pocket, chalking it up to a bad night's sleep or cheap printer ink. The second time it happened, I wasn't holding anything. I was walking through my building's lobby, keys in hand, when I passed the mirror near the elevators. I paused to straighten my jacket, then froze. My reflection wasn't mirroring me. It stood a half second too late, like a live broadcast with a lag. I lifted my right hand to touch my face. It raised its left. The movements were too smooth for a trick of the light, too deliberate for my exhausted brain to dismiss. I stepped back, watching it do the same. I waited. It smiled first, just the corners of its mouth twitching up, and then its lips parted into something I couldn't call human anymore. It didn't have teeth. It had a lack, a space that went further than it should. The elevator doors dinged open, breaking the moment, and when I glanced back, the reflection was perfectly ordinary. I didn't take the elevator. I used the stairs all the way to the 5th floor. The world felt looser after that, like the rules were being rewritten under my feet. At work, I opened an email I didn't remember writing, addressed to someone named Catherine who wasn't in our company directory. It was a simple message. What's the protocol for replacements? My sent folder was empty when I went to check later. Things in my apartment began to shift subtly. My keys stopped living in their usual bowl by the door and started appearing on the coffee table, the bathroom sink, once even on the windowsill outside, where they teetered precariously like a misplaced offering. My bookshelf became a kaleidoscope of novels I hadn't bought, spines with titles and languages I didn't recognize. A ceramic vase I'd never owned appeared on the kitchen counter one morning, filled with dead flowers that smelled faintly of smoke. At first, I tried to keep track. I made lists in a notebook. What moved, what changed, what disappeared. But the lists themselves started betraying me. Dates smudged into numbers that didn't make sense. One page I was sure I'd written was suddenly filled with a series of sketches I didn't remember making. An open door, a shadowed hallway, a single hand resting against a glass surface. I stopped keeping notes after that. The people around me shifted too, but not as objects did. They stayed the same in shape, in face, but their rhythms changed. My neighbor, who usually played guitar on his balcony every Saturday evening, started playing on Tuesdays instead. The barista at my regular coffee shop stopped asking me if I wanted almond milk and began handing me my drink before I ordered, calling me Clara. My name isn't Clara. The thing that finally broke me came one quiet Sunday morning. I woke up to find my bedroom windows wide open, curtains fluttering gently in a breeze I didn't remember inviting in. On the nightstand was a piece of paper, folded neatly, its edges too crisp to have come from anything in my home. I unfolded it. The message was short, "Stay where you are." I tried not to read into it, to brush it off as a prank, but something about it crawled inside me and stayed there. I shut the windows and locked them. That night, the locks were gone. Not broken or forced, just gone, as if they'd never existed. The thing I hated most about the changes was how quiet they were. There was no dramatic music, no ominous creaks or crashes. They just happened. The absence of noise made it feel like reality itself was politely shuffling around me, careful not to disturb me too much. I stopped going to work after I caught my boss staring at me with the kind of intense curiosity reserved for experiments under glass. His eyes darted too quickly when I caught him, and I could swear his smile was meant for someone else. Instead, I stayed home, pretending my apartment was still mine. On the last day I remember clearly, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror again. This time, it wasn't lagging. It moved with me, perfectly synchronized, but its face was all wrong. Its features were mine, but not mine, like a sketch someone had erased and redrawn too many times. "You're bleeding through," it said, its voice flat, hollow. "Stop noticing." The words hit me like a static shock, a pulse of something cold and electric. My hands were gripping the sink too tightly, my knuckles pale. "Noticing what?" I whispered, but it didn't answer. It just smiled that too wide smile again, and then it was gone, replaced by the silence of the bathroom. My reflection returned to normal. Or maybe I was the one who wasn't normal anymore. Now, the changes don't feel external. I see flickers of places I don't remember, hear snippets of conversations and languages I shouldn't understand. Once, I woke up in an entirely different apartment, unfamiliar furniture arranged in configurations that seemed to mock my attempts at normalcy. Every time I think I've found the edge of what's happening, the line stretches further. The windows in this apartment don't open, and I don't know how long I've been here. Sometimes, when I stare at the mirror too long, I hear the faint hum of something alive in the glass, something waiting. This morning, I woke to a message written on the wall in neat, blocky handwriting. You've already gone too far. Don't look back. But of course, I looked back, and now I'm not sure if I'll ever stop falling. There's a road that doesn't show up on any map. You won't find it on your GPS, and if you ask the locals about it, they'll either shrug like they don't know what you're talking about or change the subject altogether. I didn't know this when I stumbled across it on a lazy Sunday drive. I just moved to the area, a small, sleepy town nestled in the shadow of the mountains, and I was looking to explore. The road appeared out of nowhere, a narrow stretch of cracked asphalt branching off the main highway, bordered by dense, whispering pines. No signs, no mile markers. Just an invitation in the form of a sharp, sudden curve. I was bored, curious, and running on the kind of arrogance that only comes from believing you're untouchable in your own car. So, I turned onto the road. My radio flickered with static as soon as my tires crossed the threshold, and my GPS froze, the cheerful voice silenced mid-sentence. I chalked it up to poor reception and pressed on, feeling a little thrill at the idea of being somewhere off the grid. The road wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker and taller the farther I went. The canopy above seemed to swallow the light, and the air grew heavy with an almost syrupy stillness. After about 10 minutes, I realized I hadn't passed a single house or car. It was just me, my little sedan, and the endless ribbon of asphalt. That's when I noticed the marks. At first, they looked like shadows, faint smudges along the edges of the road. But as I drove closer, I realized they were handprints. Hundreds of them, pressed into the cracked pavement like a parade of ghostly signatures. Some were small, childlike, while others were broad and rough, as though made by hands calloused from hard labor. The sight of them made my skin crawl, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. The deeper I went, the stranger it got. The trees on either side of the road were scarred, their bark carved with strange, looping symbols I didn't recognize. They didn't look like initials, or the kind of graffiti-board teenagers might leave behind. They were intricate, deliberate, like they meant something. I rolled down my window, half expecting to hear the hum of insects or the distant rustle of animals. There was nothing, just silence so thick it felt alive. A mile or so later, I saw the first house, if you could call it that. It was barely more than a shack, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and rot. The windows were shattered, and the front door hung ajar, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. Something about it made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just an abandoned building, no different from the ones I'd seen in countless other small towns. Then I saw the figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But as I drew closer, I realized it was a person, standing perfectly still in the doorway of the shack. They were dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothes, a long, tattered coat and a hat pulled low over their face. I slowed the car instinctively, squinting to get a better look, but something in me screamed to keep going. I pressed the gas, my tires crunching over loose gravel as I sped past. The figure didn't move, didn't turn to watch me, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw another one, and another. They were lining the road now, standing just beyond the tree line, their faces obscured, their bodies still as statues. Every instinct I had was shouting at me to turn around, to get off this road, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. It felt like I was caught in a current, being pulled deeper into something I couldn't understand. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the road dead-ended at a clearing. The trees parted to reveal a circle of cars, dozens of them, all rusting and overgrown with moss and vines. Their windows were smashed, their doors hanging open like yawning mouths. They were all makes and models, from sleek modern sedans to old, boxy trucks that looked like they hadn't been made in decades. I got out of my car, though I don't know why. My legs felt unsteady, like I was moving on autopilot. The air in the clearing was different, thicker, almost suffocating. As I stepped closer to the ring of abandoned vehicles, I noticed that some of them still had belongings inside. A purse spilled out on a front seat, a pair of shoes lying on the floorboard, a child's stuffed animal, its fur matted with grime. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like knuckles rapping against glass. I turned, my eyes scanning the clearing, but I didn't see anything. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. It wasn't coming from the cars. It was coming from the trees. I don't remember running back to my car. I don't remember starting the engine or turning the car around. All I know is that one moment I was standing in that clearing, surrounded by silence and tapping, and the next I was barreling down the road, my hands white-knuckling the wheel. The figures were back, lining the road, their heads turning to follow me as I sped past. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if they were chasing me. When I finally burst out onto the main highway, the sunlight was blinding. I pulled over to the side of the road, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. My radio crackled back to life, spitting out a cheerful pop song, and my GPS recalculated my route like nothing had happened. I tried to find the road again the next day, thinking maybe I dreamed it or taken a wrong turn, but it was gone. The stretch of highway where I'd found it was just that, a highway, unbroken and unremarkable. I asked a few locals about it, but they just gave me blank looks or nervous smiles. I don't take Sunday drives anymore, and sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I still hear that tapping, faint and rhythmic, like it's waiting for me to find the road again, or for it to find me. The night was electric, buzzing with the hum of things unseen, like the air itself had secrets it was waiting to spill. I wasn't supposed to be there. Nobody was. Yet, there I stood, a flashlight in one hand and a fading map in the other, staring at the yawning mouth of an abandoned railway tunnel. Its arch of crumbling stone seemed to exhale the darkness within, an unnatural cold that pushed against my skin even from a distance. The dare had been simple: venture through the old Stratham tunnel and come out the other side. Everyone who had tried before had turned back, claiming to hear voices or see shadows moving just out of reach. It was local lore, an old urban legend made sinister by years of retelling. "You're not scared, are you?" James had smirked, sliding the brittle map across the diner table earlier that evening. I wasn't, or so I thought. Now, standing before the tunnel, I wasn't so sure. The first steps inside felt like entering another world. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the black, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive void. The air grew heavier with each step, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The walls, slick with condensation, seemed to draw closer, amplifying the sound of my breathing until it felt deafening. I kept my eyes forward, fixed on the faint outline of the map, though I wasn't sure why. The route was linear, just one long, straight path through the mountain. 100 steps in, I heard it, a faint scraping sound behind me. It could have been anything, a rat, loose gravel, but the noise carried a rhythm, deliberate and uneven, like something dragging itself along the ground. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. The silence stretched out, taut and brittle, until my own heartbeat became unbearable. I turned slowly, my flashlight slicing through the dark. Nothing. The tunnel was as empty as before. Still, my feet moved faster now, the echoes of my steps overlapping like a second set trailing just behind. About halfway through, I saw the first anomaly. A lantern, the old-fashioned kind with soot-streaked glass and a bent iron handle, sat on the ground in the center of the path. Its faint, yellow flame wavered without flickering, as if sheltered from any draft. I crouched to examine it, but the moment my fingers brushed the handle, the flame went out. The darkness closed in around me, more suffocating than before. My flashlight sputtered briefly, then steadied, but it wasn't the same. The light seemed weaker now, struggling to penetrate even a few feet ahead. The whispers began shortly after. They weren't loud or distinct, just faint murmurs on the edge of perception, like a conversation held in the next room. I told myself it was the wind, though there hadn't been so much as a breeze outside the tunnel. My steps quickened again, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The whispers grew louder, layered and overlapping, and I swore I could almost make out words. My name, perhaps, or something close to it. Then I saw the figure. At first, it was just a shape at the edge of my light, a vague silhouette that shouldn't have been there. It stood perfectly still, facing me, Or at least I thought it was. The lack of detail made it impossible to tell, as though it wasn't truly there, but merely a suggestion of something real. My instinct screamed to turn around, to abandon the dare and run back to the safety of the open air. But my pride, or maybe something else, kept me rooted in place. "Who's there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the tunnel's endless expanse. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, but the air shifted, growing heavier, colder. Against every ounce of reason, I took a step closer and then another. As the light inched forward, the figure dissolved, not into shadow, but into nothing, like water evaporating into the air. That's when the tunnel changed. The walls, which had been solid stone, began to ripple, as if the rock were melting. Shapes emerged from the undulating surface. Hands, faces, distorted and blurred as though seen through frosted glass. They reached outward, stretching toward me but never quite breaking free. The whispers swelled into a cacophony, words blending into a single, mournful wail that rattled my bones. I stumbled backward, dropping the map, and turned to flee. But the path behind me was gone. Where there should have been an endless line of retreating darkness, there was now only a wall, smooth and seamless, as if the tunnel had sealed itself shut. Panic surged in my chest. But before I could act, the floor beneath me gave way. I fell, not far, but far enough to knock the breath from my lungs. When I opened my eyes, the tunnel was gone. I was somewhere else entirely, a vast cavern lit by an eerie, pulsating light that seemed to come from the air itself. The walls were covered in symbols, strange and angular, that glowed faintly, shifting and rearranging when I tried to focus on them. In the center of the cavern stood an archway, carved from a black stone that seemed to drink in the light. It was empty, leading to nothing but the same pulsating air that surrounded me. Yet, as I stared into its void, I felt a pull, gentle but insistent, like gravity itself was urging me forward. Against my will, my feet moved, one step at a time, until I was standing before the arch. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming to turn back, but the pull was irresistible. As I stepped through, the world collapsed into light. When I woke, I was back at the mouth of the tunnel, lying on the cold asphalt of the highway. My flashlight was gone, as was the map, but my phone sat next to me, its screen cracked but displaying the time. 3:07 a.m., the exact moment I'd first arrived. I sat up, shaking and disoriented, and looked toward the tunnel. It was gone. In its place was a sheer rock face, as if no tunnel had ever existed. I don't talk about that night anymore. There's no one who would believe me. But every so often, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear it again. That faint, dragging sound just beyond the edge of my senses. And I know the tunnel isn't finished with me. The first hint that something wasn't right came on a Tuesday, though I didn't realize it at the time. I was writing an email at work, a simple reply to a client, when my fingers froze over the keyboard. It wasn't that I didn't know what to type. It was that I didn't recognize what I'd already written. The words on the screen were polished and professional, the kind of tone I aimed for, but I didn't remember typing them, not even a single sentence. I stared at the email, reading it over and over. The phrasing was precise, sharper than I usually managed. For a moment, I felt detached, as though the words had formed without me, but I dismissed the thought. I sent the email, closed my laptop, and chalked it up to autopilot. People do things without thinking all the time, don't they? That night, I woke to find my bedroom window wide open. The night air was freezing, and my curtains were flapping violently in the wind. I never sleep with the window open. My building is too high, and I've always been afraid of heights. The latch was on the floor, broken clean off, and my bed was dusted with frost. The odd part wasn't the cold or the latch. It was the chair. I don't own a chair. Not one like this, at least. Sitting at the window was a straight-backed wooden chair with intricate carvings along the legs. It was old, older than anything in my apartment, and the wood smelled faintly of smoke. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, trying to understand how it had gotten there. My own chair from the kitchen was still where it should be. When I turned on the lights, the chair was gone. The window was closed, and the latch was back in place, unbroken. The curtains hung still, and the frost was nowhere to be seen. I stood in the middle of my room, my chest tightening. My phone's clock read 3:14 a.m., but I couldn't tell if it was real or part of a dream I hadn't fully woken from. The next morning, I found dirt on my shoes. Not the city grime I usually walked through, but clumps of dark, wet soil like I'd been trekking through the woods. I hadn't left my apartment since coming home from work. Had I? My keys were on the counter where I always left them. My door was locked. Everything was in its place, except for the dirt. I started noticing other discrepancies. Tiny things at first, then more unsettling shifts. My phone would be full of texts I didn't remember sending, casual conversations with people I hadn't spoken to in months. At work, my coworkers stopped asking for my input during meetings, their faces unreadable when I asked why. "You told us you'd handle it," one of them said with a shrug, but I couldn't recall saying any such thing. At home, I began finding items I didn't own. A book in a language I couldn't read, a pair of gloves too small for my hands, a necklace coiled neatly on my nightstand. I threw them away, but they kept coming back, always in different places. Once, I found the gloves arranged perfectly on my pillow, the fingers pointing toward the door. It wasn't just objects. It was the spaces themselves. My apartment felt bigger some days, like the walls had stretched while I was at work. Other times, it felt claustrophobic, the ceilings pressing down on me like they were trying to fold the room in half. And then there was the smell, a faint, metallic tang that lingered in the air, stronger at night. I started hearing things, too. Not voices, exactly, but footsteps in the hall outside my door. They always came at the same time, 2:45 a.m., slow and deliberate. I listened from my bed, clutching the blanket tight, my breath shallow as the sound stopped just outside my door. It never knocked. It never entered, but I could feel it there, waiting. The turning point came when I found the photograph. It was in my coat pocket, though I hadn't worn that coat in weeks. The picture showed a forest I didn't recognize, trees dark and tangled beneath a heavy gray sky. In the center of the frame was a figure. Not a person, at least, not entirely. Its limbs were too long, its shape too blurred, like the camera had caught it mid-movement. It was standing on a path that seemed to lead straight toward the person holding the camera. Toward me. I dropped the photo like it had burned me. When I looked again, it was gone. I stopped going to work after that. Stopped leaving the apartment at all. But even inside, I couldn't escape the sense that something was slipping out of my control. The light switches flipped on and off without me touching them. My reflection in the bathroom mirror started lagging behind, my movements slightly out of sync. Once, I caught it looking at me when I wasn't looking at it. The final straw came 3 nights ago. I was lying in bed, trying to keep my eyes open. I hadn't slept in nearly 2 days, terrified of what might happen if I let my guard down. But exhaustion won. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was standing in the middle of the woods. The air was thick with mist, the ground soft and uneven beneath my bare feet. I had no shoes, no coat, no idea how I'd gotten there. The trees loomed around me, silent and oppressive. I turned in every direction, but there was no path, no break in the endless forest. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. Then I saw it, the figure from the photograph. It stood between 2 trees, its outline blurred and shifting, as if it were flickering between one shape and another. It didn't move, but I felt it watching me, its gaze heavy and cold. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My feet stayed rooted to the ground as it began to move closer. When I woke, I was back in my bed. My feet were filthy, the sheets stained with mud. The smell of the forest clung to my skin, damp and earthy. On my nightstand was the photograph, only now, the figure was gone. The path in the photo led into the woods, empty and waiting. I don't leave my apartment anymore, but it doesn't matter. I see the woods everywhere now, in the corners of my vision, in the shadows of my room. The gaps are growing longer, and when I return, I'm not always sure I'm the one who came back. The first time I noticed her, it wasn't anything remarkable. She was sitting at the back of the library, tucked into a corner with a stack of books in front of her. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her face, obscuring her expression, and she didn't look up as I passed by. I wouldn't have thought twice about her if it weren't for one strange detail. She wasn't reading the books. She was just flipping the pages one by one, barely pausing to glance at the text before moving on to the next. It was mechanical, almost robotic. I remember thinking she might be cramming for a test, or working on some bizarre research project. It wasn't until much later that I realized how deliberate it was. A week later, I saw her again at the bus stop near my apartment. She wasn't dressed for the cold, just a thin sweater over jeans, even though the wind was sharp enough to sting. She stood a few feet away, hands tucked into her pockets, staring down at the ground. It wasn't until the bus arrived, and I stepped on, that I realized she wasn't getting on. She stayed there, rooted to the spot, as the bus pulled away. I watched her grow smaller in the window, still standing perfectly still. I brushed it off as coincidence. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, and there was no reason to assume she even knew I existed. Cities were strange ecosystems full of overlapping lives, and it was easy to project patterns where there weren't any. But that thought began to waver 2 days later when I spotted her again. This time, it was at the coffee shop I frequented every morning. She was seated at a corner table, staring out the window with that same detached expression. There were no books this time, no coffee cup or laptop in front of her. Just her, sitting there, watching the street outside. I told myself to stop being paranoid. People shared spaces all the time, but I couldn't ignore the growing knot in my stomach. I knew instinctively that this wasn't random, though I couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was the stillness of her, the way she seemed out of sync with the rest of the world. She never moved unnecessarily, never glanced at her phone, or fidgeted like everyone else. She was just there, like a shadow that had stepped out of its place. Then came the drawing. I found it on my apartment doorstep late one evening, folded carefully into a square. The lines were pencil-sketched, delicate but precise, and the image was unmistakable. It was me, sitting at the library. The detail was uncanny. The way I tucked my hair behind my ear, the slump of my shoulders as I leaned over my notebook. Even the texture of the sweater I'd been wearing was captured perfectly. But what unnerved me most was that she'd drawn herself too. In the background, sitting at her corner table, half obscured by the shadows of the shelves. She was looking directly at me. I stared at the drawing for what felt like hours, my chest tight with a growing sense of wrongness. It was one thing to notice someone in passing, but this was something else entirely. She'd been watching me, not just that day, but long enough to replicate every detail. Long enough to make me feel like I'd been part of her world all along without knowing it. I wanted to believe it was a joke, maybe even some kind of misunderstanding. But the next time I saw her, any illusions of harmlessness evaporated. It was late, nearly midnight, and I'd gone out to take the trash to the curb. The street was quiet, the orange glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. As I turned back toward the building, I saw her standing at the edge of the parking lot. She was perfectly still, hands hanging loosely at her sides, her face illuminated just enough to see that same detached, almost serene expression. "Do you need something?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer. She just tilted her head slightly, as if studying me, before turning and walking away. Her movements were fluid, unhurried, and something about the way she disappeared into the darkness made my skin crawl. After that, the sightings became more frequent. She was always just far enough away to make confrontation difficult, always in places that felt too coincidental to ignore. Once, I saw her sitting on a park bench across from my office during my lunch break. Another time, I caught her reflection in the window of a train as it pulled away, standing on the platform, watching. Each encounter was like a jigsaw piece that didn't quite fit, and I was too close to the puzzle to see the whole picture. Then, one night, I woke up to a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the living room, soft and rhythmic, like nails dragging across wood. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay still, but curiosity, or maybe desperation, won out. I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed, heart pounding as I edged toward the noise. The room was dark, the shadows stretching long and strange, but the sound was unmistakable now. It was coming from the window. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain, and there she was. Her face was pressed to the glass, her breath fogging the surface in uneven bursts. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was something behind them. Something sharp and deliberate, a hunger that made my stomach churn. She didn't move, didn't flinch, even as I stumbled back and fumbled for my phone to call the police. By the time they arrived, she was gone. No footprints in the dirt outside, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The officers were polite but dismissive, suggesting it might have been a prank or even a bad dream. But when I returned to my bedroom, I found another drawing on my nightstand. This one was different. It was of my living room, drawn from the perspective of someone standing just outside the window. In the center of the room, she'd drawn me, staring back at her, terrified. I haven't seen her since that night, but I don't feel safe. I don't know what she wanted or why she chose me, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still watching, waiting. Every shadow in the corner of my vision, every stranger in a crowd, feels like it could be her. And the worst part is, I don't know if I'd even see her coming. The first thing I noticed about the house was its silence. Not the comforting quiet of an old home resting after decades of life, but a taut, brittle silence that pressed against your ears, waiting for something to break it. I'd rented the place on a whim, an old Victorian on the outskirts of town, ridiculously cheap. It's just me, why not? I'd thought, needing the space as an escape from the chaos of the city. I didn't question why the rent was so low. At first, the second night there, as I unpacked boxes in the upstairs bedroom, I found a note wedged into the frame of the closet door. The paper was aged, the ink smudged, but the words were clear enough. There's one rule: don't look for it. I stared at the note for a long moment, the ambiguity of it unsettling. What was it? Was this some cryptic prank left behind by the last tenant? My instinct told me to toss the paper and forget about it, but instead, I slid it into the back of a drawer. I told myself it wasn't important, but something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The next few days passed uneventfully, save for a vague sense of being observed. It wasn't the feeling of being watched, exactly. It was subtler, as though the house itself was aware of me. The creak of floorboards didn't sound random. Shadows seemed slower to dissipate in the corners. I shook it off. Old houses settle, I told myself. I'd read that in a home magazine once, and it sounded like the kind of practical reasoning I needed to cling to. But then the noises started. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible. A tap, tap, tap that echoed through the walls late at night. I assumed it was pipes or tree branches brushing against the siding, but as the nights passed, the sound grew more distinct, sharper. The taps turned into scratches, faint but deliberate. They came in threes, always from somewhere just out of sight, beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, once even from inside the closet where I'd found the note. I began sleeping with the lights on, though sleep was a generous term for the fitful dozing I managed. The scratches came even then, punctuating the stillness at odd intervals. I told myself it was mice or some other pest, but that didn't explain the pattern. Always three. Scratch, scratch, scratch. One night, I decided to investigate, armed with a flashlight and a stubborn resolve to prove there was a rational explanation. I moved through the house, checking every nook and cranny. I found nothing. Still, as I returned to my bedroom, a strange sound stopped me in my tracks, breathing. Not my own. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from the floor beneath my feet. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. The house had no basement, just a crawl space I'd never bothered to check. My heart thudded as I crouched and pressed my ear to the floorboards. The breathing stopped. In its place came a soft whisper, so faint I couldn't make out the words. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and spent the rest of the night sitting rigid on the bed, staring at the floor. The next day, I called an exterminator. I didn't tell him about the whispering, of course, just the scratches. He spent an hour inspecting the crawl space in the attic, then came out shaking his head. No signs of anything, he said. No droppings, no nests, nothing. You sure you're hearing things? I wanted to argue, but I didn't. Instead, I asked him to board up the crawlspace hatch. He did, though his expression made it clear he thought I was being paranoid. That night, I slept better, The scratches didn't come. For the first time in weeks, the house felt normal. It lasted 3 days. On the 4th night, I woke to the sound of the closet door creaking open. I shot up in bed, heart hammering. The door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the room. I stared, my pulse loud in my ears, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, faintly, I heard it, scratch, scratch, scratch. Not from the closet this time, but from the floor beneath the bed. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat, and I clutched the blanket as though it could shield me from whatever was there. The scratches grew louder, more insistent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. They stopped, then came again from the walls. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and the whispering returned. This time, it was clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. Finally, I bolted. I grabbed my keys and fled the house, not stopping until I reached a motel on the edge of town. The fluorescent lighting of the room felt surreal, too bright after the suffocating darkness of the house. I didn't sleep, but at least the whispers didn't follow me. The next morning, I returned, hoping the daylight would make the house feel less sinister. It didn't. The silence was worse now, heavier. I decided to pack up my things and leave for good. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want any part of it. As I was packing, I found the note again, the one I'd hidden in the drawer. This time, there was something written on the back. You broke the rule. My blood turned cold. I hadn't looked for anything. I'd done my best to avoid it. But the words stared back at me, an accusation I couldn't deny. The last thing I did before leaving was check the crawl space. The hatch, which had been securely boarded up days ago, was wide open. Inside, the darkness seemed alive, shifting and undulating like smoke. I didn't wait to see what was in there. I ran. I never went back to the house. I never even told the landlord I was leaving. But some nights, in the quiet of my new apartment, I hear it again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Always in threes. Always closer than I'd like. I was 26 when I moved into the house on Cedar Lane. It wasn't my dream home, not even close. The rent was cheap, the appliances were ancient, and the wallpaper was peeling in every room. But it was mine, and after 3 years of couch surfing and splitting rent with roommates who left dirty dishes in the sink for weeks, I was ready for a place where I could breathe. It was one of those houses with a personality. Not the charming kind, though. It leaned to the left, like it was perpetually drunk, and the floors creaked even when no one was walking on them. The realtor called it quirky, which I quickly realized was code for falling apart in ways you won't notice until you live here. But the rent fit my budget, and I figured I'd make the best of it. The first night, as I unpacked in the living room, I noticed something strange. A small door, no taller than my knees, tucked into the wall beneath the staircase. It wasn't on the blueprints the realtor had shown me. I didn't think much of it at the time. Old houses had weird features, right? I tugged the little latch, curious to see what was inside, but it wouldn't budge. The latch felt warm, though, which I wrote off as residual heat from the day. I promised myself I'd get a crowbar or something later to pry it open and moved on. For the next few weeks, life was normal, mostly. The kind of routine that settles in when you're trying to make a new place feel like home. I painted the walls, bought a few houseplants, and set up my cheap IKEA furniture. At night, though, the house felt different. It wasn't just the creaks and groans of an old structure settling. It was quieter than it should have been, like the walls were holding their breath. Sometimes I'd wake up with the distinct feeling that someone had been standing in the doorway, watching me. The dreams started after the first month. They weren't nightmares, exactly, but they left me waking up drenched in sweat. Always the same. I was in the house, but it wasn't my house. The rooms stretched on endlessly, looping in impossible ways, like a funhouse without the fun. There was a voice, low and hollow, calling my name from somewhere deep inside. I never found the source. One night, the dreams took me to the little door under the stairs. In the dream, it was wide open, and a thin, pale hand was beckoning me inside. When I woke up, my bedroom door was ajar. I never slept with it open. By the time the second month rolled around, I couldn't ignore the noises. Scratching, not in the walls, like a rat or a squirrel, but under the floorboards, directly beneath my bed. I would lie there in the dark, holding my breath, listening to the faint, deliberate sound of nails dragging against wood. It stopped as soon as the sun came up, like whatever was making the noise only existed at night. Then, there was the mirror. It hung in the upstairs hallway, directly across from my bedroom door. I hadn't noticed it at first, probably because it was so grimy that it barely reflected anything at all. But one morning, as I was getting ready for work, I saw something in it that didn't make sense. My reflection was off by half a second. When I raised my hand to touch my face, the version of me in the mirror hesitated before doing the same. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light, but I avoided looking at it after that. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it wasn't under the floorboards. It was coming from the little door. The sound was slow and deliberate, like whatever was inside wanted me to know it was there. My stomach twisted, and every instinct screamed at me to walk away, but I couldn't. My feet carried me to the staircase as if I didn't have a choice. The latch was unhooked. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. The door swung open on its own, revealing a tunnel that shouldn't have been there. The air that wafted out was thick and damp, like the breath of something ancient. At first, I couldn't see anything, just a dark, narrow passage that sloped downward. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something move, just a flash of white against the blackness, like fabric trailing behind someone as they turned a corner. I should have slammed the door shut. I should have called someone. Instead, I crouched down, peering into the tunnel, and called out. My voice sounded weak, even to me. "Hello?" The reply wasn't a word. It was laughter, quiet, low, and broken, like a record stuck on repeat. It didn't come from the tunnel, though. It came from behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The laughter stopped, leaving me in silence so heavy it felt like the house itself was listening. I slammed the little door shut and pushed a chair against it, though I knew that wouldn't do much good. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't dream, either, but when I finally crawled out of bed at dawn, the tunnel door was open again, the chair pushed neatly back against the wall. The next few days blurred together. I barely ate, barely left the house. Every time I tried to focus on something, work, the TV, even just scrolling through my phone, I'd feel that same heavy stillness, like someone was waiting for me to notice them. The mirror in the hallway seemed to grow dirtier by the hour, until it was more black than glass. But when I tried to take it down, it wouldn't budge. My reflection, if it was even mine anymore, watched me struggle with a faint, mocking smile. It all came to a head on the last night I spent in that house. I woke up to the sound of the scratching, louder than ever, and this time, it wasn't under the bed or behind the little door. It was everywhere. Inside the walls, the ceiling, even the air itself. The mirror in the hallway had gone completely black, and as I stood there, staring into the void, something stared back. It wasn't me. It wasn't human. The thing in the mirror tilted its head, grinning wide enough to split its face. Then it raised a pale hand and pointed to the little door. I left everything behind that night. My furniture, my clothes, my photos. I drove to a motel 3 towns over and didn't look back. Last week, I saw the house listed for rent again. They've lowered the price. I wonder if the new tenant has noticed the door. I'd always prided myself on being a good judge of character. People watching was my secret hobby, and I loved imagining their lives from the small details they revealed. The old man with the frayed coat at the bus stop, a retired professor, the woman tapping her foot in line at the grocery store, a musician late for rehearsal. But the man I met at the laundromat one rainy Tuesday, I couldn't figure him out, and maybe that's what made me talk to him in the first place. The laundromat was empty except for me and him. He was folding clothes at the table near the vending machine, his movements deliberate and precise. A dark green jacket hung on the back of his chair, beads of water rolling off the fabric from the rain outside. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. "Quiet day," he said, his voice calm, almost measured. "I guess people don't like to venture out in weather like this." I smiled politely and went back to loading my machine. There was nothing extraordinary about him. Average height, average build, with sharp features softened by the beginnings of crow's feet. But something about him felt deliberate, like every movement and word had been rehearsed. I brushed it off. Small talk with strangers was part of laundromat life. He didn't say much else, and I was halfway through my book when he spoke again. "What are you reading?" I held up the cover, The Secret History. His eyes lit up. "That's one of my favorites. Donna Tartt has a way of making you feel like you're right there, doesn't she?" I agreed, a little surprised. It wasn't a book you heard people casually mention. We ended up chatting about literature until my dryer buzzed. His name was Owen, and he told me he'd moved to the area a few months ago for work. We exchanged a few more pleasantries, and then he left, the bell above the door jingling softly in his wake. When I left a while later, I noticed something strange. His car, a navy sedan parked near the entrance, was still there, the windows fogged from the rain. I glanced around, expecting to see him nearby, but the street was empty. It struck me as odd, but not worth dwelling on. Maybe he'd gone to one of the nearby shops. Over the next few weeks, I saw him everywhere. At first, it felt coincidental. We ran into each other at the grocery store, then at a cafe where I liked to write. Each time, he greeted me warmly, always with something thoughtful to say. "I hope you're enjoying the book," he said once, gesturing to the novel I'd been reading at the laundromat. Another time, he asked about the weather app I'd mentioned using, something I barely remembered telling him. It was nice in a way, a familiar face in a city that often felt too big and impersonal. But then the encounters started feeling too frequent, too perfectly timed. One morning, I stopped at a park to clear my head after a bad night's sleep. There he was, sitting on a bench, tossing crumbs to the birds. He looked genuinely surprised to see me, but his words sent a shiver down my spine. "I had a feeling you'd come here." I laughed it off, but his tone lingered with me. I'd never mentioned liking this park, let alone coming here when I needed to think. Later, at home, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an innocent comment, just a coincidence blown out of proportion by my overactive imagination. Then the notes began. The first one appeared on my windshield after work. A single sheet of paper, tucked under the wiper, with a line scrawled in neat handwriting. "You looked beautiful today." There was no name, no indication of who had written it. My stomach tightened. I scanned the parking lot, half expecting to see Owen's car, but the lot was mostly empty. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of him as I drove home. The second note came 3 days later, slipped under my apartment door. This one was more specific. "I hope the coffee was to your liking." My chest tightened. That morning, I'd gone to the cafe where I'd last seen Owen. I hadn't told anyone, hadn't posted about it, hadn't even mentioned it in passing. I stayed up that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the thread connecting these moments. Had Owen been following me? Was I imagining connections where none existed? Every noise outside my window made me jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long. The last straw came a week later. I'd gone out with a friend, hoping to escape the gnawing paranoia that had taken root in my mind. It was late when I got home, and as I reached my door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My breath caught. I hadn't left it open. I stepped inside cautiously, my pulse hammering in my ears. The living room was untouched, but when I entered the bedroom, my stomach dropped. On the bed was a stack of folded clothes, my clothes. On top was the dark green jacket Owen had worn at the laundromat. I backed out of the apartment, my hands shaking as I called the police. When they arrived, they searched the entire place but found no sign of forced entry. The officers were sympathetic, but had little to go on. "Could be a prank," one of them suggested. "Or maybe you left the door unlocked by accident." I knew better. I knew it wasn't a prank. I hadn't left the door unlocked, and I knew the jacket hadn't been left there by mistake. I changed my locks, moved to a different part of the city, and deleted all traces of my old routine. For a while, things felt normal again. But every so often, I catch a glimpse of a navy sedan in my rearview mirror, or hear the soft jingle of a bell that sounds too much like the one at the laundromat door. "Owen, or whoever you are, let's not meet again." I first noticed the house on a day when I shouldn't have been on that road at all. My usual route home was blocked by construction, so I had to take the back roads. The kind of roads that wound around fields and woods with no streetlights, just shadows and the occasional glint of animal eyes in the dark. The house stood at the crest of a hill, crooked and leaning, like it had grown tired of holding itself together. I wouldn't have thought much of it if not for the single window glowing softly with light. It was odd. The house didn't look like it had power, or even occupants. The siding was warped and peeling, the yard overrun with weeds so tall they seemed to quiver in the breeze like something alive. But the light in the window felt warm, inviting even, like the kind of glow you'd see from a fireplace in the middle of winter. I couldn't explain why I slowed my car, or why I stared at it for as long as I did. There was nothing remarkable about it, yet it tugged at me in a way that was almost physical. The next day, I passed it again. Same window, same light, same tugging feeling in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of my overactive imagination. But the day after that, I found myself slowing down again, even leaning forward to get a better look. It didn't make sense. There were no signs of life around it. No car in the driveway, no mailbox, no tire tracks in the dirt leading up to the sagging porch. And yet, the light burned on. By the end of the week, it wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was obsession. I started looking for reasons to take that road, even when the main route reopened. Each time I passed the house, the pull grew stronger, until one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I parked my car on the side of the road, heart racing, and stepped out into the night. The air was colder than it should have been for early autumn, and the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves clung to everything. I walked up the driveway, weeds brushing against my jeans. The house loomed above me, its shape sharp and unnatural against the sky. Up close, the glow from the window was more pronounced. It wasn't a soft yellow light like I'd thought. It was pale, almost silvery, like moonlight trapped inside. When I reached the porch, the wood groaned under my weight, and for the first time, I hesitated. But then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the window. A shadow passing by, quick and fluid. My pulse spiked, and before I could stop myself, I knocked on the door. The sound echoed far too loudly for a house that looked as if it might collapse at the slightest breeze. I waited, feeling ridiculous and terrified all at once. When no one answered, I knocked again. The door swung open before my hand made contact. There was no one on the other side, just darkness and that pale, silvery light spilling out from somewhere deeper inside. I should have turned around. I should have gone back to my car and driven home, but I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It wrapped around me like water, heavy and damp, sinking into my skin. The second thing was the silence. No hum of electricity, no creak of settling wood. Just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. The light came from a room down the hall, its glow spilling onto the warped wooden floor. I don't know why I kept walking. It was as if the light was pulling me, just like it had pulled me from the road. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was resisting me. The walls seemed to lean inward as I moved, the hallway narrowing, though I knew that was impossible. When I reached the room, I stopped in the doorway. The light was coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, swinging slightly as if it had just been disturbed. The room was empty, save for a small wooden table in the center. On the table was an object that made my stomach lurch. It was a picture frame. Inside was a photo of me. Not an old photo, not something from my past. It was recent, so recent that I was wearing the same jacket I had on at that very moment. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the hallway behind me was empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but no matter where I looked, there was nothing there. Then, a voice, low and rasping, so close it could have been whispering in my ear. "You came back." I ran. The house didn't seem the same on my way out. The hallway stretched on forever, the walls pressing closer and closer until I was sure I'd be crushed. When I finally burst through the front door and into the night, I didn't stop running until I was in my car, slamming the door and peeling out onto the road. The light in the window was gone. I haven't taken that road since. I tell myself it's over, that I imagined it, but deep down, I know better. 2 days ago, a package arrived at my door. No return address, no postage, just a plain brown box sitting on my welcome mat. Inside was the picture frame. The photo had changed. Now, it shows me standing in the doorway of that house, staring out at the camera. Behind me, in the shadows of the hallway, something is watching. When I first moved into the cottage, I thought I'd struck gold. It was cheap, secluded, and perched on the edge of a forest that hummed with life. The landlord had seemed almost too eager to rent it to me, offering a deal so good I didn't even bother negotiating. I figured he just wanted to offload the place to someone willing to take on the remote location. At the time, that someone was me. After the chaos of city living, I craved quiet. For the first week, it was perfect. The air smelled of pine and earth, and I woke every morning to sunlight spilling through the wide kitchen window. At night, the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the steady croak of frogs from a nearby stream. It felt like the kind of peaceful retreat you only see in movies or ads for herbal tea. Then, on the 8th day, I noticed the scratches. They were faint but deliberate, a series of thin, uneven lines carved into the wood of the back door. I assumed it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other forest creature trying to get in. I shrugged it off and made a mental note to pick up a lock for the trash bin. But the next morning, the scratches were worse. Longer, deeper. This time, they curved in strange, looping patterns, almost like letters, though not in any language I could read. It unsettled me enough to take a picture, intending to show it to someone, though I wasn't sure who. Animal control? My landlord? The internet? That night, I woke up to the sound of shuffling outside the window. It was soft, almost rhythmic, like someone dragging their feet across gravel. I froze, my body tense under the blankets, listening. The shuffling stopped, replaced by a faint tap-tap-tap against the glass. I wanted to convince myself it was just a branch swaying in the wind, but there was no wind. The next day, I found footprints in the dirt outside the window. They were human, or at least close enough. The proportions were wrong, though. Toes too long, arches too high, the outline unnervingly narrow. I measured one with my hand. It was nearly twice the size of my own foot. That was when I decided to call the landlord. "Oh, that," he said, his voice maddeningly casual. "You're in the woods. Things happen. Animals, you know." "These aren't animals," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Someone's been outside my house." He sighed like I was a child complaining about imaginary monsters. "It's just the area. Old places get weird, especially at night. You'll get used to it." I didn't get used to it. Over the next week, the disturbances escalated. The scratches on the door became more intricate, swirling and spiraling into shapes that made my eyes ache if I stared too long. I stopped sleeping near the windows because the tapping came every night, and it never stayed in one place for long. First the bedroom, then the kitchen. Once, it was the bathroom window while I was brushing my teeth, making me drop the toothbrush and back away so fast I nearly tripped. The worst part wasn't the noises, though, or the scratches, or the footprints. It was the things I started finding inside. At first, they were small, a feather, a stone, a shard of bark, left in places I could almost convince myself I'd put them. A feather on the nightstand, a stone on the kitchen counter. But then it was a clump of hair coiled neatly in the sink. A single tooth resting on my pillow. Things that didn't feel like gifts or pranks. Things that felt like warnings. I bought a camera, hoping to catch whatever, or whoever, was tormenting me. The first night, I set it up facing the back door and sat awake in the living room, scrolling mindlessly on my laptop. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. The faint shuffle, the almost familiar tap-tap-tap. My skin crawled, but I didn't move. I wanted proof. When the noise stopped, I let out a shaky breath and crept to the camera. The footage showed nothing. The scratches were deeper, though, and this time, they unmistakably formed words. "Leave now." I should have packed my bags that second, but something stubborn rooted me in place. Anger, maybe, or pride. I wasn't about to let some creep with too much time on their hands scare me out of my new home. I called the police, who came, looked around, and left without finding anything. "Probably just kids," one of them said, his tone so dismissive it made me furious. "Kids," I repeated, pointing to the footprints by the window. "Do these look like kids' footprints to you?" He He didn't answer. The following night, I bolted every door and window, armed myself with a flashlight, and stayed up with the lights on. I kept waiting for the tapping, the shuffling, but the house was eerily silent. For the first time in weeks, I started to relax. Then, around 4 a.m., the smell hit me. It was thick and putrid, like rotting meat left out in the sun. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve, and stumbled into the kitchen. The smell was stronger there, almost unbearable. I opened the fridge, expecting to find something spoiled, but everything inside was fine. Then I saw it. A black, viscous stain spreading across the floor, oozing out from beneath the door to the basement. I didn't even know the house had a basement. I stared at the door for what felt like hours, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The smell grew worse, choking the air, forcing me to breathe shallow gasps. Finally, I reached for the handle. It was ice cold, almost sticky, and my hand recoiled instinctively. The door opened on its own. The stairs beyond descended into pitch darkness, the kind so complete it felt alive. My flashlight barely penetrated it. The beam swallowed before it could reveal anything of value. The air was colder here, the smell more suffocating. I stepped back, my instinct screaming at me to leave, but as I turned, I saw it. Something moving at the edge of the light. Not moving, exactly. Growing. It stretched upward, too many limbs unfolding, too many eyes glinting like shards of glass. It didn't make a sound, but the weight of its presence pressed down on me, filling my chest with a terror so raw it was almost physical. I stumbled back, tripping over the stairs, and slammed the door shut with all the strength I had. I don't remember much after that. Just running, the sting of cold air on my face as I bolted into the forest, not stopping until my legs gave out. When I finally looked back, the cottage was gone. Not distant gone. I don't know how long I was in the woods before someone found me, cold and delirious. They told me there was no cottage, no landlord, no rental agreement. Just an overgrown patch of land where nothing had stood for decades. I've tried to tell myself they're right, that I imagined it all, but I still smell it sometimes. That rotting stench. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again. I didn't catch the scent of betrayal all at once. It wasn't a single moment of discovery, but a gradual awakening, like finding yourself ankle-deep in quicksand, realizing too late that the ground had shifted beneath you. At first, the changes were too subtle to name. He still said good morning, still asked how my day went, still kissed me before bed, but the words landed differently. There was a lack of weight, like paper feathers scattered in the wind. One evening, while I was folding laundry, I noticed a button missing from his favorite shirt. It seemed inconsequential, a tiny thing, but it stayed with me. He'd been wearing that shirt when he came home late 2 nights ago. Just some overtime, he'd mumbled, kicking off his shoes without looking at me. The image of that missing button hung in my mind like a thread begging to be pulled, though I couldn't say why. Days turned into weeks, and his patterns became a puzzle I couldn't solve. He'd always been terrible at keeping secrets, the kind of man who'd buy me a birthday gift and blurt out what it was a week in advance because he couldn't contain his excitement. But now, he had become careful, deliberate. His phone, once left carelessly on counters and coffee tables, now lived in his pocket like a second heart. "Who keeps texting you?" I asked one night, half joking, when the screen lit up for the 3rd time during dinner. He tilted his head like a dog hearing a high-pitched sound. "Nobody. Just work stuff." He said it so smoothly, so casually, that I almost believed him. Almost. The following Saturday, I found myself alone in the house. He had left early, claiming he needed to pick up something at the hardware store. An hour passed, then 2. I told myself I wouldn't snoop, but when I saw his laptop on the desk, open and glowing faintly, it felt like an invitation. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. It was a ridiculous thing to do. What was I hoping to find? Evidence? A confession? Still, my curiosity won. What I found wasn't incriminating, not at first glance. Just emails, calendars, mundane work documents. But then, buried in his browser history, was a name I didn't recognize. A name that appeared again and again, linked to reservations, tickets, and late-night searches for boutique florists. My breath caught in my throat. Who was she? When he returned that afternoon, carrying a bag of screws that seemed entirely too small for 2 hours of shopping, I couldn't look at him. I mumbled something about being tired and retreated to the bedroom, where I stared at the ceiling until the sun dipped below the horizon. That night, I dreamed of strangers. Faces I didn't know, voices I couldn't place. I woke up with a sharp ache in my chest, the kind you get when you're running in a dream but can't seem to move fast enough. I decided to confront him the next evening. I cooked dinner, lit candles, poured wine. The whole cliché. He walked in, took one look at the setup, and smiled cautiously. "What's the occasion?" he asked, sitting across from me. "Who's Emily?" I asked, my voice steady but brittle. His fork froze midair. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Then, slowly, he set it down. "Emily?" he repeated, as though testing the name on his tongue. "She's a client." "Why?" I felt the air shift between us, thick with something unsaid. "You've been spending a lot of time with her," I said. "Dinner reservations, flowers. It's more than just work." His face turned pale, and I thought for a moment he might deny it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on a spot just above my shoulder. "It's not what you think," he began, but the words sounded like a placeholder, a way to stall for time. I didn't need to hear the rest. The truth was already there, unspoken but undeniable. I stood up, leaving my untouched plate behind, and walked out the door. For days, I felt like I was moving underwater, slow and heavy, every step an effort. Friends offered advice, sympathy, even anger on my behalf, but none of it reached me. I kept replaying our last conversation, the way his voice cracked when he said my name, as if he wanted to pull me back but didn't know how. A week later, he showed up at my door, holding the shirt with the missing button. "I fixed it," he said, his voice small. He handed it to me, and I stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. It felt absurd, like trying to mend a shattered mirror with a single shard. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "I don't know why his words faltered, and he rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit I knew too well. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't need them. Some wounds can't be undone, no matter how sincere the apology. I took the shirt and closed the door, the final thread between us severed. Months passed, and the ache faded into something softer, less jagged. One day, while walking through a park, I saw a couple laughing on a bench. The woman leaned into the man, her head resting on his shoulder, their hands entwined. It wasn't them. Of course, it wasn't. But for a moment, I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I smiled. Not because I was over it, not because I'd moved on, but because I realized I no longer wanted to hold on to what had been lost. The missing button, the unspoken lies, the quiet unraveling. It was all part of a story that had ended, and that was okay. It was a Tuesday, though I can't say why I remember that. Maybe because Tuesdays are such ordinary days, and what happened couldn't have felt less ordinary. It began. No, not began. It emerged the way a whisper might in a crowded room. Subtle, almost ignorable, but insistent. The first thing I noticed was the air in my apartment. It had a faint metallic tang, like rain on hot asphalt, except it hadn't rained for weeks. I thought it might be the old radiator acting up, but the air grew heavier each day, pressing against my lungs as though it had weight. When I mentioned it to my neighbor, Mrs. Kolb, she laughed and said her air was just fine. "Maybe you need to air the place out," she suggested, her hands twisting the edge of her cardigan like she was nervous for no reason. She always fidgeted, but that day it seemed worse. Her fingers moved too fast, jittery, as if her body were a second ahead of her mind. At first, I blamed exhaustion. Work had been relentless, and the deadlines blurred my days. But the unease burrowed deeper, like a splinter in my mind. Objects in my apartment shifted, not in obvious ways. Nothing dramatic like a chair moving across the room, but small, intimate changes. The kind you wouldn't notice unless you were sure of where things belonged. My favorite mug had a hairline crack that wasn't there the night before. The painting above my couch, something I'd bought years ago on a whim, suddenly had a figure in the background, a small silhouette that hadn't existed in its original abstraction. I tried to brush it off, to rationalize, but then there were the sounds. It started late at night, just as I was drifting off. A soft humming, like a distant engine. It came from nowhere in particular, yet everywhere at once. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, enough to make sleep impossible. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound seemed to seep through my skin, vibrating in my chest. The hum came every night after that, never varying, never pausing, as though it was stitched into the fabric of my apartment. When I asked Mrs. Kolb about it, she smiled a strange, flat smile. "What humming?" she said, her voice lilting with a forced cheerfulness. "Maybe it's the pipes. Old buildings are noisy." The next morning, I woke up to find the mirror in my bathroom tilted. It had always hung perfectly straight, but now it slanted downward, reflecting only the sink and the faintest edge of my chin. I reached out to adjust it, but my fingers brushed against something slick and cold on the mirror's surface, a texture I couldn't see. It wasn't wet, exactly, but it clung to my skin like oil. I went to work, desperate for normalcy, only to find it slipping through my grasp. My coworkers felt different. Not hostile, not warm, just empty. Conversations fizzled into silence, their voices trailing off mid-sentence, as though they'd forgotten how to form words. One of them, David, stared at his computer screen for nearly an hour without typing a single thing. When I asked him if he was okay, he turned to me with a smile that stretched too far, his teeth unnaturally bright against his pale skin. "Just fine," he said, his voice hollow. I stopped asking questions after that. The humming followed me everywhere now, not just at home, but on the streets, in my car, even at work. I thought I'd grown used to it until it began to change. The hum sharpened, rising and falling like it was breathing. At times, it almost sounded like a voice, though I could never make out the words. I decided to leave town for the weekend, thinking distance might help. As I packed, I caught sight of the painting again. The figure in the background was closer now, its silhouette more defined. It had the shape of a person, but the edges of its body blurred, like smoke trapped under glass. The drive out of town felt like a dream, the landscape too still, the colors too muted. When I stopped for gas, the attendant didn't even look at me. He moved with jerky, mechanical precision, his hands filling the tank and taking my money without a word. I didn't make it to the cabin I'd rented. No matter how far I drove, the same landmarks kept appearing. A red barn, a crooked tree, a dilapidated gas station. At first, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, but the GPS insisted I was on the right road. My phone, though, had no signal, the bars flickering in and out like they were taunting me. I turned back, and when I arrived home, my apartment felt unfamiliar. The layout was the same, but the details were wrong. The wallpaper had a pattern I didn't recognize. The window in the kitchen was an inch narrower. My belongings were in their usual places, yet they didn't feel like mine anymore. And then I saw it. In the bathroom mirror, over my shoulder, the silhouette from the painting stood behind me. It wasn't a blur anymore. It had form, detail. Its face was mine, but its expression was wrong. It grinned at me, teeth sharp and glistening, though my own face was frozen in shock. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The lights flickered, the air buzzed, and when I turned around, the bathroom was empty. But the mirror? The mirror showed my apartment, yet not my reflection. It showed a place much like mine, but darker, grayer, with furniture that was just slightly out of place. A knock at the door startled me. I rushed to open it, hoping for someone. Anyone, human. It was Mrs. Kolb. She stood in the hallway, her hands clutching her cardigan as usual. But her face was melting. Her features blurred, sliding downward like wax in the sun. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere but her mouth. "Do you see it now?" I slammed the door and locked it, my chest heaving. I turned back to the mirror. The figure in it was closer now, grinning at me from inside my home. The humming rose to a crescendo, drowning out my thoughts. And then, everything went silent. I don't know how much time has passed since. Days? Weeks? The mirror no longer shows me. It shows the figure. It moves when I move, smiles when I cry. The air is heavier than ever, and the hum is gone, replaced by whispers. They're coming from the walls, and they're calling my name. When I first took the job at the library, it was meant to be temporary, a stopgap while I figured out what to do with my life. The pay wasn't great, but it had a certain allure. Quiet days surrounded by books, no demanding coworkers, and the charm of a historic building. The library was old, built in the early 1900s, with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and those narrow, labyrinthine aisles you only see in old movies. There was something timeless about it, something that made me feel like I was stepping into another era every time I walked through its heavy oak doors. The head librarian, Mrs. Morley, gave me the tour on my first day. She was brisk and no-nonsense, the kind of woman who wore her hair in a tight bun and had probably been born with a permanent frown. "Most of the collection is straightforward," she said, leading me through the aisles. "But the North Wing is special. Historical documents, rare books, some donations from private collections. We keep it locked unless someone requests access." "Why locked?" I asked, glancing at the heavy iron gate that separated the North Wing from the rest of the library. Mrs. Morley's frown deepened. "Some of the materials are fragile, and some, well, they require supervision." I didn't press further. At the time, it seemed like one of those eccentric librarian things. Rare books needing supervision sounded quirky, not ominous. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. My shifts were spent shelving returns, helping the occasional patron, and learning how to navigate the library's antiquated catalog system. The North Wing stayed locked, its gate looming like an afterthought in the corner of my vision. I didn't think much about it until the night I was scheduled for closing duty alone. It was raining that evening, the kind of steady drizzle that makes the world feel smaller. The library's usual patrons had cleared out early, and by 8 p.m., I was the only one left in the building. I was tidying up the front desk when I noticed the light. It was faint, a soft golden glow seeping out from the cracks in the North Wing's gate. I froze, my hand still hovering over the stack of books I'd been organizing. No one had requested access to the North Wing that day. Mrs. Morley had made sure of it. The key to the gate was still in the drawer where I'd last seen it. My first thought was that someone had broken in. But how? The gate's lock was solid, and the only other entrance to the wing was a door accessible only from the restricted archives, which was itself locked tight. I told myself it was probably a faulty light bulb, some old wiring flaring up and casting strange shadows. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. I grabbed the key from the desk drawer and approached the gate, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. The light dimmed as I drew closer, flickering like a candle in a breeze. By the time I unlocked the gate and stepped inside, it was gone. The North Wing was silent. The shelves towered above me, their shadows stretching into strange, jagged shapes under the faint light of the emergency sconces. The air felt different in there, denser, cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. I scanned the rows of books, half expecting to find someone crouched between the shelves. But the wing was empty, save for the rows of spines and the faint rustle of pages shifting in the draft. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. One of the books was out of place, sticking slightly forward from the shelf like a misaligned tooth. It was bound in dark leather, its cover unmarked except for a single symbol pressed into the center. A spiral that seemed to twist in on itself the longer I stared at it. I shouldn't have touched it. I knew that even as my hand reached for it, drawn by some magnetic pull I couldn't explain. The second I pulled the book free, the lights flickered. The air seemed to shift around me, a faint pressure pressing against my ears. I opened the cover, half expecting brittle pages or faded ink. Instead, the first page was blank, smooth and pale as bone. As I turned the pages, I realized they were all blank, empty, except for faint impressions, like something had been written there once but had been erased so thoroughly that only ghosts of the words remained. I didn't hear the footsteps until they were right behind me. I spun around, clutching the book to my chest. No one was there, but the aisle didn't look the same anymore. The rows of shelves seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, far longer than they should have. The emergency sconces flickered again, their dim glow barely illuminating the oppressive darkness. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast, quiet expanse of the north wing. There was no answer, but I felt something. A presence, not a person, but something vast and old, watching me from just beyond the edge of the light. The spiral on the book's cover seemed to twist and shift in my hands, as though alive. I closed the book quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. When I turned back toward the gate, it was gone. In its place was another aisle, identical to the one stretching endlessly before and behind me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was lost, trapped in a space that didn't make sense, in a place that wasn't following the rules of the world I knew. I don't know how long I wandered. Hours, maybe, days. The north wing's shelves seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, their angles subtly wrong, as though they were leading me somewhere. The whispers started when I found the second book. It was on a pedestal in the center of a clearing formed by the shelves, its cover marked with a different symbol, this one resembling an eye. As I approached, I could hear them. Faint, overlapping voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. The whispers grew louder as I opened the book. Unlike the first, its pages weren't blank. They were filled with dense, spidery text that seemed to crawl across the paper, shifting whenever I tried to focus on it. And in the center of each page was a single word that burned itself into my mind, glowing faintly in the dim light. Stay. I don't know how I found my way out. The last thing I remember is running, the bookshelves blurring into indistinct shapes as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. When I finally stumbled through the gate, gasping for air, the north wing was dark and silent. The book I'd taken was gone. I quit the next day. Mrs. Morley didn't ask for an explanation. She just gave me a knowing look, her frown deeper than ever, and said, "Not everyone's suited for this place." I didn't take anything with me when I left, but sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of a spiral or an eye out of the corner of my vision, on the edge of a shadow, or in the static of a TV screen, and I can still hear the faintest whisper of that single, unyielding word. I didn't recognize the house at first. It was just another stop on my route, one of dozens I made each day as a courier. The house was a little set back from the street, shrouded by overgrown hedges and a tall iron gate that didn't quite close. The package was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. The recipient's name was Mrs. LeClaire. I pressed the buzzer on the gatepost, half expecting no one to answer. Instead, the speaker crackled to life. "Leave it by the gate," a woman's voice said, crisp and formal. The interaction was unremarkable, but the tone stuck with me. Something about the way she spoke, precise and clipped, felt strange, detached. I followed her instructions, snapping a picture of the package as proof of delivery, and went on with my day. But over the next few weeks, the same address kept popping up on my route. Each time, the instructions were the same. Leave the package by the gate. No contact, no questions. I wouldn't have thought much of it except for the packages themselves. They were always small, wrapped identically, with no identifying information about the sender. And the more deliveries I made, the more I noticed things about the house. A curtain shifting slightly as I walked away. A faint tapping sound coming from inside, rhythmic and deliberate. The turning point came one rainy afternoon when I arrived to find the gate open. Not just unlocked, wide open, as if inviting me in. The package that day was heavier than usual, its edges reinforced with thick packing tape. I hesitated, glancing at the open gate. Should I go up to the door? Call out? The buzz of my work phone pulled me back to reality, a reminder to keep moving. I set the package on the stone step inside the gate and turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint and distant. Wait. It wasn't the sharp, commanding tone I'd heard through the buzzer. This voice was softer, almost pleading. I turned back, scanning the windows, but I saw no one. For a moment, I stood there, rain soaking through my jacket, waiting for something, anything. But the voice didn't come again. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about the house had unsettled me from the start, but now I felt sure something was wrong. I told myself to let it go, to focus on my job and not get involved in things that didn't concern me. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that someone had needed help. The next day, I searched for the address online, hoping to find some innocuous explanation. What I found instead was silence. No property records, no listings, no mention of the address at all. It was as though the house didn't officially exist. The name, Mrs. LeClaire, brought up nothing either, except an old obituary from 20 years ago. It was for a woman who had lived in a different state, but the photo in the article caught my attention. She was wearing a distinctive brooch shaped like a raven. I'd seen the same brooch in the driveway of the house, half buried in the dirt by the gate. The next time I delivered a package, I decided to test the waters. After leaving it by the gate, I lingered, pretending to look for something in my bag. Sure enough, I heard the faint tapping again. It was coming from one of the upstairs windows. I squinted through the rain and saw a pale hand press against the glass. The fingers curled slightly, beckoning me. My stomach churned. Was this some kind of prank? Or something worse? When I got back to my van, I made up my mind. I'd call the police. Even if I sounded ridiculous, it was better than ignoring what might be someone in danger. But just as I reached for my phone, it buzzed with a message. The number was unknown. Don't come back. Stay away. My heart raced. I looked back at the house. The gate was shut again, though I hadn't seen or heard anyone close it. That night, I slept poorly. My dreams were fragmented. Images of the house, the hand at the window, the packages. I woke up with a start just before dawn, my phone buzzing again. Another message from the unknown number. You were warned. When I arrived at work, I told my supervisor I wouldn't be delivering to that address anymore. He gave me a strange look but didn't press the issue. I was relieved, though I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I'd left something unfinished. Days turned into weeks. I avoided that part of town entirely, but the house lingered in the back of my mind. Late one night, I decided to drive by. I told myself it was just to prove there was nothing to fear, that I'd let my imagination get the better of me. The house looked different in the moonlight. The hedges seemed taller, the iron gate darker and more menacing. I parked a block away and approached on foot, my steps silent on the wet pavement. As I reached the gate, I saw something new. A small wooden sign hanging from the bars. It wasn't there before. The letters were crudely carved, uneven and jagged. No deliveries. A chill ran through me. I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I looked back at the house. The upstairs window, where I'd seen the hand, was wide open. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadow, its outline barely visible against the dim light inside. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched me. I ran back to my car and didn't stop until I was home. That was the last time I went near the house. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, I get messages from that same unknown number. They're short, cryptic. Things like, "Why didn't you listen?" Or, "We're still waiting." I've blocked the number, but the messages always come back, as if they're written into my phone itself. And once, after a stormy night, I found a package on my doorstep. Small, plain, wrapped in brown paper. No address. No sender. The first sign something was off came when the mailman knocked. He always came at noon. Always rang the bell once. Always greeted me with a brisk morning, even when it wasn't morning. Today, though, it was different. He rang 3 times in quick succession, a pattern so hurried it bordered on frantic. When I opened the door, he handed me a package and said nothing. His uniform was wrong, a muted brown instead of the familiar blue. "Rough day?" I asked, trying to make light of it, but his face didn't move. He just stared at me, his lips pressed into a thin, pale line, and walked away without a word. The package wasn't for me. My name wasn't on it, nor was my address. It wasn't addressed to anyone, really, just a blank space where the recipient should be, sealed with no return label. It was heavy in my hands, the cardboard edges oddly warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in the sun, though the day was cloudy and cold. I set it on the counter and stared at it for a long time, debating whether to open it. Something about it prickled at the edges of my mind, a sensation like standing at the top of a staircase and suddenly doubting you'd counted the steps correctly. I decided to leave it alone. Whatever it wasn't mine. That was when the house changed. Subtle things at first. The painting in the hallway, a still life of apples and a wine bottle, was upside down. The faucet in the kitchen dripped a rhythm that didn't match its usual tempo, each drop hitting the sink like a hammer strike. My reflection in the hallway mirror seemed off, like the expression on my face was half a second behind the movement of my body. I walked back into the kitchen and froze. The package was gone. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I searched the counters, the floor, even the trash, though I knew it couldn't have ended up there. A sound from the living room drew my attention, a soft rustle, like paper being unfolded. When I stepped into the room, I saw it immediately. The package was on the coffee table, the tape removed, the flaps open. I hadn't opened it. I knew I hadn't. But there it was, sitting innocently, as if daring me to look inside. I approached it slowly, my breathing shallow, and peered into the box. It was empty, except for a single object resting in the center, a key. It was old-fashioned, brass with an intricate bow shaped like twisting vines. It shimmered faintly, though there was no light to catch, and when I reached for it, I felt a strange pull, as though the key were drawing me closer. The moment my fingers closed around it, the world tilted. It wasn't a physical sensation, but something deeper, as if reality had shifted on its axis. The lights flickered. The hum of the refrigerator stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt alive. I heard footsteps in the hall. They were deliberate, measured, the sound of boots on hardwood, but I knew every inch of my home, and I knew there shouldn't have been anyone there. The footsteps moved closer, then stopped just outside the living room doorway. "Who's there?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. There was no response. Instead, a shadow stretched across the threshold, long and thin. Its shape human but distorted, limbs too angular, joints bending in impossible ways. The shadow moved without a source, creeping into the room like spilled ink. My grip tightened around the key. "Don't let go," a voice whispered, low and distant, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. It wasn't coming from the shadow. It was inside my head. I stumbled backward, clutching the key so tightly it bit into my palm. The shadow seemed to recoil at my movement, retreating slightly but not disappearing. It hovered there, just out of reach, as if waiting for something. The air between us felt heavy, thick with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The voice came again. "Don't let go. It's not safe." I didn't understand what it meant, but I held onto the key like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The shadow shifted, its edges rippling like water, and then it lunged toward me. I screamed, falling back against the coffee table, and the key burned hot in my hand. The shadow froze mid-motion, as though something unseen had stopped it. Then, slowly, it began to dissolve, breaking apart into wisps of black smoke that vanished into the air. When it was gone, the room felt empty in a way it never had before, as though something fundamental had been removed. The key in my hand cooled instantly, and I stared at it, my mind racing. What had just happened? I didn't have long to think. The doorbell rang again, 3 sharp bursts like before. My stomach churned. When I opened the door, the same mailman stood there, holding another package. His uniform was still wrong, his face still too pale, but this time he spoke. "You need to return it," he said, his voice hollow and mechanical. He thrust the box toward me. "You shouldn't have taken the key." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog that had suddenly gathered at the end of the street. I looked down at the package in my hands. This one was heavier than the first, and when I set it on the counter, the warmth radiating from it was almost unbearable. The voice came again, louder this time. "Don't trust him. Don't return it." The room around me seemed to pulse, the walls breathing in and out like living tissue. I stared at the package, the key still clutched in my other hand, and realized with a cold, sinking certainty that whatever I decided next, there was no going back. The first time I noticed anything strange, I was standing in the cereal aisle at the grocery store. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and my basket was heavy with everything but what I had come for. I reached for a box of oatmeal, but the moment my fingers brushed the cardboard, it wasn't the oatmeal in my hand. Instead, it was a photograph. It took a second for my brain to process what I was seeing. The photo showed me, standing right where I was, holding a box of oatmeal, but the rest of the aisle looked wrong. The shelves behind me were empty, the fluorescent light dimmed to a sickly yellow. There was something just out of frame, a shadow or blur, looming at the edge of the image. My reflection in the glossy surface of the photo didn't look surprised. It looked resigned. I dropped it as though it had burned me. The oatmeal box was on the shelf where I'd left it, and the photograph was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't the kind of thing I could explain to anyone without sounding insane. I tried to brush it off as a trick of my imagination, a fleeting glitch in the machinery of my mind. But the photograph lingered at the edges of my thoughts, sharp as a paper cut. The next time something happened, it was on my way home from work. I had just stepped off the bus and was walking down my street when I saw myself, not a reflection, not a shadow, but me, standing at the corner a block ahead, waiting as though I'd been expected. I froze. My other self, my doppelganger, my twin, whatever it was, waved. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was slow, deliberate, almost mocking. My feet moved before my brain could decide whether it was a good idea. I ran toward it, shouting, demanding an explanation. It didn't run. It didn't react at all, except to turn the corner and disappear from sight. When I reached the spot where it had stood, my street was empty, silent. The air smelled faintly of burnt plastic, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. At home, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror for far too long. I wanted to find some difference, some crack in the surface that would prove I was still me, that whatever I had seen wasn't a part of me breaking away. But the face in the mirror stared back, unchanged, and I couldn't tell which of us was lying. It escalated quickly after that. I started finding things in places I'd never put them. A single key in my shoe, a lighter tucked inside a coffee mug, scraps of paper with words I didn't recognize scrawled in my handwriting. You already know. Keep going. Don't look down. I didn't know what they meant, but they carried the weight of instructions, even warnings. My apartment began to feel like a puzzle box, one I hadn't agreed to solve. And then came the nights I didn't recognize. One moment, I'd be washing dishes or brushing my teeth, and the next, I'd be somewhere else. Not somewhere far, but places I shouldn't have been able to reach in the time it took to blink. A park across the city, a parking garage I didn't remember entering, a stretch of highway I hadn't driven in years. Each time, the world seemed slightly out of alignment. Trees bent at unfamiliar angles. Streetlights hummed with a sound that wasn't electricity. It was in one of those nights, standing on a deserted overpass, that I met her. She looked like me, but she wasn't me. Her hair was shorter, her eyes sharper, like she'd seen 1,000 things I hadn't. She was waiting by the edge of the railing, arms crossed, watching me approach with an expression that was equal parts amusement and pity. "You're slower than I was," she said. Her voice was mine, but it carried a confidence I didn't recognize. "Who are you?" My voice cracked as I spoke. "I'm you," she said. "A few steps ahead, a few steps behind. It doesn't really matter." That doesn't make any sense. Of course it doesn't. Not yet. She glanced at something over my shoulder, and for the first time, I noticed the shadows shifting. Something large, indistinct, was moving at the edge of the overpass, its form flickering like a bad signal. "What is that?" I asked, my throat tightening. Her gaze snapped back to mine. "That's not your problem. Not yet." "Why is this happening to me?" "Because you noticed." She stepped closer, her face inches from mine. "Once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. And when you stare too long, something stares back." She placed a hand on my shoulder, squeezing it with a kind of desperate urgency. Her touch was cold, as though she'd been standing in the snow. "Whatever you do, don't stop moving. And don't trust what you think is real." Before I could respond, she shoved me hard. I stumbled back, tripped, and hit the ground. When I looked up, she was gone. The overpass was gone too. I was back in my apartment, sprawled on the living room floor. The clock on the wall blinked 4:13, though I couldn't remember the last time it had worked. The photograph was on the coffee table now, waiting for me. The image had changed. It showed me standing on the overpass, staring at the shadow. My other self was nowhere to be seen. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if it matters. The cracks are everywhere now. in reflections, in memories, in moments that slip through my fingers like sand. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see her staring back, not smiling, not mocking, just waiting. And I'm starting to think she's waiting for me to stop moving. I never thought much about the old man at the library. He was just a fixture of the place, as much a part of its atmosphere as the creaky chairs or the musty smell of yellowing paper. He sat at the same table near the windows every evening, a notebook and a pen before him, though I never saw him write a word. His hair was thin and white, his glasses perched precariously on his nose. There was nothing particularly strange about him. At first, I started going to the library after work, trying to escape the noise of my apartment and the monotony of my small, lonely life. It was peaceful there, a haven of quiet. I liked that people left me alone, and I left them alone. That was part of the unspoken pact of library goers. But the man started noticing me. Or maybe it was just that I started noticing him noticing me. It began subtly. He'd glance up when I walked in, his watery blue eyes following me as I chose my usual seat across the room. He'd look for a moment too long, just enough to make me aware of him before returning his gaze to his notebook. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting some inner awkwardness onto a harmless old man. But as the weeks passed, the glances became more persistent, more deliberate. If I looked up, I'd catch him staring, his expression neutral, his pen unmoving on the page. One evening, I arrived later than usual, finding my favorite spot taken. I wandered aimlessly for a minute before reluctantly sitting at a table closer to his. As I settled in, I felt a strange tension, like the air had thickened. The man looked up, his gaze sharper than I'd ever seen it, and smiled. It wasn't a warm or friendly smile. It was almost knowing. "Good evening," he said, his voice gravelly but calm. I nodded politely, unsure what to say. His voice carried a weight, like the words were tethered to something larger. "Hi. You've been coming here a lot lately," he remarked, tilting his head slightly. I felt a flicker of discomfort. "I like it here. It's quiet." He nodded, as though this answer was satisfactory. Quiet is good. People don't appreciate quiet anymore. They fill it with nonsense. I gave a non-committal smile and looked down at my book, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't speak again, but I could feel his eyes on me, even when I didn't look. The sensation stayed with me long after I left the library that night. After that, I started altering my routine. I'd arrive at different times or choose a different table, anything to avoid sitting near him. But it didn't matter. He always seemed to know where I was. If I moved to the second floor, I'd hear his slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs moments later. If I switched to a spot tucked in the back, I'd glance up to find him walking past, his eyes grazing mine before he looked away. Once, I caught him standing by the shelves, not even pretending to browse, just staring directly at me. It wasn't overtly threatening, but it felt calculated, like he wanted me to notice him noticing me. One night, as I packed up my things to leave, I found him standing by the door. He wasn't blocking my way, but he might as well have been. His presence was heavy, commanding. He smiled that strange, knowing smile again. "You read a lot of mysteries," he said casually, gesturing to the book in my hand. I froze. It wasn't the kind of observation a stranger should be able to make. I hadn't spoken to him about what I read, and I was careful not to leave my books in plain view. "Do you like solving puzzles?" he continued, his tone conversational but unsettling. "I guess," I said cautiously. "Why?" He shrugged, but his smile widened. "Just curious. You seem like someone who's good at noticing things." I didn't know how to respond to that. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to walk past him, muttering a quick good night as I hurried out the door. I didn't look back. The next morning, I found a slip of paper tucked into the book I'd borrowed. It was a page from a notebook, the edges jagged where it had been torn out. Written in neat, precise handwriting were the words, "What happens when the puzzle solves you?" I felt sick. I looked around the library, half expecting to see him lurking nearby, but he wasn't there. I handed the note to the librarian, hoping for some kind of explanation, but she just frowned and said, "I haven't seen anyone near your table. Are you sure you didn't leave it there yourself?" Her words left me doubting my own memory. Had I imagined it? Could I have accidentally picked it up somewhere else? But deep down, I knew. It was him. That evening, I returned to the library, determined to confront him. I didn't know what I planned to say. Maybe I'd demand he leave me alone or threaten to report him. But when I arrived, his table was empty. His notebook and pen were gone. The spot looked untouched, as though he'd never been there. I asked the librarian if she'd seen him. She gave me a puzzled look. Who? The old man, I said. He's always here in the evenings. She hesitated, her brow furrowing. I've been working here for years, and I don't know anyone who fits that description. I left the library feeling unmoored, like the ground beneath me had shifted. Had I been imagining everything? Was I just some lonely, paranoid woman inventing stories to fill the void in my life? The library is still my refuge, though I catch myself glancing toward the windows more often, half expecting to see him sitting there, watching. Sometimes I find myself replaying our conversations in my head, wondering if I missed something, if there was a message hidden in his words. And every now and then, I'll find a slip of paper in the books I borrow, always with the same neat handwriting. The puzzle isn't finished yet. I don't know what he meant, but I feel like I'm still solving it, or it's solving me. When the parcel arrived, I wasn't expecting anything. There it was on my porch, a small brown box sealed with thick black tape, no label or return address. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, feeling its odd weight. It wasn't heavy, but dense, like the kind of thing you'd expect to be fragile but wasn't. My name was scrawled on the top in black marker, but the handwriting was jagged and unfamiliar. I carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter like it might sprout teeth and bite me if I wasn't careful. I had no enemies. No exes who might send me anything out of spite. No quirky friends prone to practical jokes. Yet here it was, addressed to me, sitting in my home like it belonged there. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a key, plain brass, tied with a strip of faded red ribbon. No note, no explanation, just the key, sitting in a nest of shredded newspaper. It had the kind of weight that suggested it belonged to something important, something that had been locked for a long time. I picked it up and held it to the light, searching for any engravings or identifying marks. Nothing. For the next hour, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone sent it to the wrong address. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was intentional, that whoever sent it knew I would open the box and find this key. And worse, that they expected me to do something with it. The first incident happened that night. I was brushing my teeth when the bathroom light flickered. Not the usual buzz and dimming you get with bad wiring. This was different. The light didn't just flicker. It pulsed, like a heartbeat. My reflection in the mirror seemed wrong, subtly off, as if it was reacting to something I couldn't see. I turned the light switch off and on, and everything returned to normal. But when I looked back at the sink, the key was there, resting on the porcelain as though I'd placed it there myself. I hadn't. It was still supposed to be on the counter. I didn't touch it again. I grabbed a towel, covered the key, and left the bathroom, locking the door behind me like that would somehow fix things. But that night, I dreamed about it. The dream was vivid, like a memory I didn't recognize. I was in a room I'd never seen before. Stone walls, damp and cold. The air smelled metallic, like rust or blood. In front of me was a door, massive and ancient, with iron bands that looked like they'd been there for centuries. I was holding the key. My hand moved on its own, guiding it toward the lock. I wanted to stop, to pull back, but I couldn't. The key slid in with a satisfying click. When I woke, the sheets were damp with sweat, and my hand ached like I'd been gripping something too tightly. The key was on my nightstand. That was when I knew. It wasn't just a key. It was calling me to something, leading me somewhere, and it wasn't going to stop. I decided to get rid of it. I drove out to the edge of town, to a spot by the river where the currents were fast and merciless. Without hesitating, I hurled the key into the water and watched it disappear. I felt lighter on the drive home, certain I'd severed whatever strange tie had brought it to me. But when I walked through the front door, the key was sitting in the middle of my living room floor. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door from the dream, looming and massive. I could hear something behind it, something shuffling and waiting. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. If the key wanted me to find the door, then I would. Maybe if I gave it what it wanted, this would stop. I didn't have to look far. The key seemed to guide me, subtly, nudging me with instinct and coincidence. I found myself driving down roads I'd never taken, cutting through paths in the woods I didn't know existed. The farther I went, the heavier the air became, pressing against my chest like a warning. At the edge of an abandoned industrial park, I found it. The door was exactly as I'd seen it in my dream, massive and ancient, with iron bands that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. It was set into the side of a crumbling brick building, utterly out of place and undeniably wrong. My hands trembled as I approached, the key dangling from the red ribbon like a dead weight. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to leave this place and never look back. But I couldn't. The key burned in my palm, urging me forward. When I reached the door, I saw faint carvings in the iron, symbols I didn't recognize, etched so deeply they looked like scars. I slid the key into the lock. The sound was deafening, a deep groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. The door shuddered, and for a moment, I thought it wouldn't open. But then it did, slowly, inch by inch, revealing darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light. Something was in there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a presence vast and overwhelming. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything that should exist. The air buzzed with static, and my vision blurred, as if the sheer wrongness of it was too much for my mind to process. The last thing I remember is the door slamming shut. I woke up in my car, parked miles away from the industrial park. The key was gone. For weeks, I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever I'd done by opening that door hadn't followed me back. But every so often, I catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there, shadows that stretch too far, whispers in empty rooms. And sometimes, when the world is quiet, I swear I hear the sound of a door creaking open, far away but getting closer. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world gleaming and raw. Water pooled in the dips of the pavement, reflecting the pale light of a reluctant sun. Emma stood at the edge of her porch, her boots scraping the wood. The air carried that heavy, metallic smell storms leave behind, as if the earth had been scrubbed clean of something nobody could see. The letter was still on the porch swing where she'd left it the night before, its envelope soft and damp from the mist. She hadn't dared open it, though she'd known instantly who it was from. The handwriting on the front, a jagged script that slanted sharply to the right, was unmistakable. Colin. 3 years of silence, broken by a single envelope. She should have thrown it away the moment she saw it. She should have burned it. Instead, she brought it inside and set it on the swing, as if leaving it outdoors could keep it at a safe distance from her life. But there it was, still intact, a small, white reminder that you can never truly outrun the past. She picked it up now, turning it over in her hands. Her fingers brushed the frayed edge where the seal had started to peel, and she swallowed hard, bracing herself for whatever he had to say. The envelope gave way reluctantly, as though it had also been dreading this moment. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. When she unfolded it, her breath caught. It wasn't a letter, exactly. It was a map, hand-drawn, with jagged lines marking rivers and roads she didn't recognize. At the center of the map was a black X. No note, no explanation, just the map and the X. Her first instinct was to laugh. This was classic Colin, wasn't it? Always a puzzle, always a game. Even when they were kids, he turned everything into a riddle she had to solve, as though every interaction were an elaborate test of her loyalty. She'd thought he would grow out of it, but the games had only grown more complicated over time. Until one day, they stopped altogether. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. She folded the map and stuffed it into her pocket. She didn't plan to follow it, of course, but the idea of leaving it behind felt impossible. It was like a splinter lodged under her skin, small enough to ignore, but persistent enough to keep her awake at night. The day unfolded slowly, with the kind of unease that comes from knowing your mind is elsewhere. She tried to work, tried to focus on the endless emails and meetings that usually swallowed her hours without mercy. But the map lingered in the back of her thoughts, as if the X were a magnet pulling at her resolve. By mid-afternoon, she gave up trying to resist. She took an early lunch, grabbed her jacket, and started driving. The map didn't provide an address, only landmarks. A crooked tree here, a bridge with missing planks there. It was the kind of navigation that felt deliberately archaic, as though Colin had gone out of his way to make the journey as inconvenient as possible. Typical. She followed the directions anyway, winding her way through back roads that seemed to grow narrower with every turn. By the time she reached the final marker, a dilapidated windmill perched on the edge of a steep ravine. Her knuckles were white against the steering wheel. The X was supposed to be just beyond the windmill, in the thick woods that bordered the ravine. She parked and stepped out, her boots sinking into the mud. The trees loomed tall and ancient, their branches twisting together like hands clasped in prayer. She hesitated at the edge of the woods, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But then she remembered Colin's laugh, the sharp, knowing sound of someone who always thought they were one step ahead. The sound of him daring her to quit. She pushed forward, the map clutched tightly in her hand. The forest was darker than she'd expected, the canopy so thick that even the pale afternoon sun couldn't penetrate it. The air smelled damp and earthy, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. She counted her paces, tracing the map's path as best she could. And then she saw it. The clearing was small, almost perfectly round, as though carved deliberately into the heart of the forest. In the center stood a stone pedestal, weathered and cracked with age. On top of it was a box, its surface black and polished like obsidian. She approached cautiously, the hair on the back of her neck prickling. The box didn't seem to belong here. It was too clean, too perfect, as though it had been placed here yesterday. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside was a watch, an old pocket watch with a silver chain. She recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her father, a man she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. The sight of it was enough to knock the air from her lungs. She remembered the weight of it in his hands, the way he used to polish it with the corner of his shirt, his voice low and deliberate as he told her the importance of keeping time. Her heart hammered in her chest as she picked it up, the chain pooling in her palm. There was a note beneath it, folded so precisely it could have been cut with a blade. She opened it, her fingers brushing against the edges of the paper. "You deserve to know the truth." That was all it said. No name, no signature, no instructions. Just those 5 words, written in the same jagged handwriting as the envelope. Emma stood there for what felt like hours, the watch heavy in her hand. The forest seemed to press closer, the air thick with questions she couldn't answer. She thought about leaving the watch behind, about walking away and pretending this had never happened. But she knew she couldn't. Whatever truth Colin thought she deserved, it was here, somewhere, waiting for her to find it. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to look. It began with the footprints, faint outlines of soles, tracked across the dusty floorboards of the old farmhouse I'd inherited from my uncle. I noticed them while unpacking, their patterns breaking up the otherwise even layer of dust in the long-neglected living room. They weren't mine. They were smaller, narrower, and pointed toward the center of the room, where nothing but an old rug lay draped across the floor. I stood there for a long moment, feeling a dull pressure behind my ribs, but eventually dismissed them as old prints left from movers or some previous tenant. The house was old. Old houses have stories, I told myself. The footprints didn't clean themselves, though, so I fetched a broom and began sweeping. When I lifted the rug to clean beneath it, I found a trapdoor. The wood was aged, its edges blending almost seamlessly with the floorboards around it. It had no handle, just a circular groove that begged for fingers to hook into it. My uncle hadn't mentioned a basement when he left the house to me, and I hadn't noticed anything about it in the brief walkthrough I'd done before moving in. But there it was, as real and solid as the air suddenly thickening around me. I stood there for a moment, the broom still in my hand, then dropped to one knee and pulled. The door groaned like an animal in pain, revealing a set of steep stairs descending into the dark. The smell hit me first, a sharp, earthy scent, as though the ground beneath the house had been sealed off for centuries. My phone's flashlight barely penetrated the gloom. I thought I saw the edges of stone walls, but I couldn't be sure. The air carried a faint, metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. I shut the trapdoor without going down. That night, the footsteps began. At first, they sounded faint, almost tentative, like someone testing the weight of the floorboards. I lay in bed listening, frozen beneath the blankets as they moved back and forth across the living room. I told myself it was the house settling, that my ears were inventing sounds because I was alone and tired. The next morning, I found the footprints again, a fresh set leading from the trapdoor to the front window. The thought that someone, or something, had been in the house while I slept made my skin crawl. I bought locks for every door and window, as well as a heavy deadbolt for the trapdoor. Installing it made me feel better, if only slightly. I spent the day cleaning and arranging furniture, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me since I'd found that door. By the time evening rolled around, the house looked almost cozy. The footsteps returned that night. They were louder this time, more insistent, pacing through the living room before stopping directly beneath my bedroom. I lay there, heart pounding, as the sound began to move upward. My bedroom door rattled in its frame, the handle twisting back and forth as though someone were trying to open it. I don't know how long I stayed frozen in bed, clutching the sheets, before the noise stopped. The next morning, I found the trapdoor open. The deadbolt lay on the floor, twisted and snapped, as though some enormous force had pried it apart. The footprints had spread throughout the house now, crisscrossing every room. They stopped abruptly in front of mirrors, at the vanity in the master bedroom, the bathroom sink, the hall mirror by the front door. In each one, there was a faint fog on the glass, as though someone had been standing there, breathing. I called the police. They were kind but dismissive, chalking it up to an intruder playing tricks or my own nerves getting the better of me. They didn't find any signs of forced entry. One of the officers even laughed when I showed him the twisted deadbolt, suggesting it had simply been defective. They left after an hour, leaving me with a weak smile and a promise to patrol the area. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with a kitchen knife in one hand and my phone in the other, waiting for the footsteps to return. They didn't. The house was eerily silent, as though holding its breath. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever connection I had to this house, whatever sentimentality had kept me here, was gone. I packed a bag and drove into town, planning to stay at a motel until I could figure out what to do next. When I returned that afternoon to grab the rest of my things, the house felt different. The air was heavier, and a strange warmth radiated from the floor. In the living room, the rug had been pushed aside, and the trapdoor stood wide open. From where I stood, I could see the stairs descending into the darkness. The air was thick with the metallic smell I'd noticed before, now sharper, more cloying. Something shifted in the shadows below, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against stone. I don't know what compelled me to step closer. Maybe it was the need for answers, or maybe something deeper, something I didn't want to name. As I reached the edge of the trapdoor, the darkness seemed to pulse, drawing me in. My phone's flashlight illuminated the stairs, then the stone walls, then the figure standing at the bottom. It wasn't human. It stood too tall, its limbs too long and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its skin was gray and mottled, and its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly in the beam of light. It didn't move, but I felt it watching me, felt the weight of its gaze pressing into my chest. I slammed the trapdoor shut and ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away. I never went back to the house. I didn't even call to arrange for my things to be picked up. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself it was some kind of hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and always coming closer. The first oddity appeared in the middle of a thunderstorm. I was in my kitchen, nursing a mug of tea and watching rain hammer against the windows, when the power flickered. It wasn't a typical blink, no quick off and on. Instead, the lights pulsed, dimming just enough to give the room a watery, shifting quality. And in that brief distortion, I saw her. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her back to me, her hair damp as though she'd come in from the storm. She didn't turn around. I didn't move. Then, The lights surged back to full strength, and she was gone. I laughed it off, because what else do you do? It was an afterimage, I told myself, some combination of fatigue and a weird shadow cast by the storm. The brain plays tricks when it's tired. But I couldn't quite shake the image of her. Thin shoulders, the delicate arc of her neck, the way the rain had clung to her like a second skin. That night, I dreamed of the ocean. I hadn't been near the sea in years, but in the dream, it stretched out in front of me, black, endless, and pulsing with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Something about it drew me closer, but the sand beneath my feet was wrong, too soft, too yielding. I sank with every step, deeper and deeper, until the water lapped at my knees. I woke gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. The storm had passed, but the air in the room felt heavy, like the atmosphere just before a lightning strike. I might have ignored it, chalked it up to stress, bad weather. But the next morning, there was a single wet footprint on the kitchen floor. The print was small, the kind a barefoot child might leave after running through a sprinkler. Just one, near the table where I'd seen her. I checked everywhere. No leaks, no open windows. The floor was dry except for that single mark, which had already begun to fade by the time I grabbed a towel. That's when I started paying attention. For days, nothing else happened. I went to work, came home, ate dinner, and tried to forget the dream, the storm, the footprint. But there was a crack in the rhythm of my days now, a tiny fault line that I couldn't stop probing. It wasn't just the absence of anything overt. It was the way normalcy had taken on a brittle quality. My routines felt thinner, as though I could reach out and press my hand against them and they would give, like wet paper. Then came the cat. I don't own a cat. I never have. But one evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught movement in the bathroom mirror, a flicker of fur darting past the open doorway. I froze, toothpaste frothing in my mouth. "Hello?" I called out, half laughing at myself. There was no answer, of course, but when I leaned into the hallway, the air smelled faintly of salt water. I didn't sleep that night. In the days that followed, I began seeing the cat everywhere. It never lingered long enough for me to get a clear look, just a flash of sleek, dark fur disappearing around a corner or under a piece of furniture. Once, I heard it purring, low and rhythmic, like the distant roll of waves. I told a friend about it over drinks, expecting her to laugh and tell me I was being ridiculous. Instead, her face grew still. "Do you ever hear it talk?" she asked. I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking. She didn't laugh back. "You should be careful," she said. "Sometimes they follow you." That was the last time we spoke. The dreams came back with a vengeance after that. Always the ocean, always pulling me closer. The sand grew wetter with every step, until I wasn't walking at all but swimming through a tide of black water. And in every dream, just before I woke, I'd see her, the woman from my kitchen. She was always ahead of me, just out of reach, her wet hair tangling in the current. The first time I heard the knocking, it was faint. 3 sharp taps at the window, deliberate and rhythmic, even though I live on the 4th floor. I didn't go to the window. The second time, it came from the front door. The sound was louder, more insistent, but when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. Just the hallway, dim and empty, stretching out like a tunnel. The third time, it was inside. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, trying not to think about the way the lights kept flickering, when the knock came from beneath the table. Slow, deliberate, a sound like bone against wood. I didn't look. I didn't need to. The next morning, I found another footprint, this one larger, as though whoever, or whatever, had left it before was now growing. It wasn't just wet this time. It was smeared with something dark and gritty, like silt dredged from the bottom of a lake. That's when I noticed the cat again, perched on the back of my couch, its dark eyes fixed on me. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to it or to myself. The cat blinked, slow and deliberate, and when I stood to chase it off, it didn't run. It simply melted into the shadows of the hallway, the same way she always did in my dreams. I haven't left the apartment in days. The knocking has stopped, but the air feels wrong now, thicker, like the world has been submerged. The lights no longer flicker. They don't turn on at all. Last night, I dreamed of the ocean again, but this time, I wasn't alone. She was there, standing on the shore, her face obscured by the tangle of her wet hair. Behind her, the cat prowled in slow, measured circles, its movements liquid and seamless. When I woke, the salt smell was stronger than ever, and this morning, the sand started creeping under the door. The first time it happened, I thought it was déjà vu, a fleeting, harmless glitch in the mind. I was in the supermarket, reaching for a jar of peanut butter. My hand was inches away when everything froze. Not in the dramatic, time-stands still way you see in movies, but subtly. The air thickened, like I was underwater. I felt detached, as if my body and mind were briefly out of sync. When the sensation passed, my hand was on the jar, but I had no memory of actually grabbing it. A small thing, easily dismissed. But that was the beginning. At first, it was confined to moments like that, strange gaps in the mundane. I'd notice I was holding a cup of coffee, but wouldn't recall making it. My laptop would be open to an email I couldn't remember drafting. Then it began to feel bigger, like the gaps weren't just moments anymore. One day, I blinked while brushing my teeth and found myself standing in the middle of my bedroom, the toothbrush gone. The minty taste lingered in my mouth, but the bristles had vanished, along with a chunk of time. The most unsettling part was how natural it felt during those lapses, as though nothing was wrong until after it was over. No sudden jolts, no dramatic realization, just an eerie aftertaste of absence. I started writing things down, trying to track the lapses, but the notes I left myself were strange. One morning, I found an entry that read, "Don't look at the clock. It's lying to you." The handwriting was mine, but I didn't remember writing it. Friends began noticing things. "You seemed off last night," my coworker James said after a team dinner. "Kept asking the same question about the menu, over and over. You don't remember?" I laughed it off, but my stomach churned. I didn't recall the dinner at all. That night, I checked my phone and found a group photo from the restaurant. Me in the center, smiling too wide. My hands were clenched in my lap like I was holding something I didn't want anyone to see. I couldn't look at the picture for long. It escalated when the voices began. At first, it was faint, soft murmurs at the edge of sleep, like a distant conversation bleeding through a thin wall. But one night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from outside the room. It was inside my head, a tangle of overlapping words I couldn't quite grasp. Just as I thought I might make out a phrase, the voices stopped, leaving only a deafening silence. Then there was the mirror. It's hard to explain what happened, but one day, as I stood brushing my hair, I noticed something wrong. Not about my reflection itself, but about the space around it. The room in the mirror seemed a little sharper than reality, the colors more vivid. When I leaned closer, I thought I saw movement, a flicker in the corner of the reflection that didn't exist in the real room. I backed away, my heart pounding, but when I turned around, the room behind me was still. The following night, I woke up at 3:12 a.m., standing at my living room window. My hands were pressed against the glass, my breath fogging the surface. I couldn't remember getting out of bed, but that wasn't what frightened me. It was the street outside. There was nothing there. No cars, no buildings, no streetlights. Just darkness. A void so complete it felt alive. I stepped back, and in the reflection of the window, I saw myself still standing there, face pressed to the glass. My other self smiled. I ran back to bed, pulled the covers over my head, and waited for morning. But it didn't feel like morning ever came. The sunlight through the blinds looked artificial, like someone had painted it on. My phone told me it was 7:48 a.m., but the clock on the stove blinked nonsense, 88:88. I didn't eat. I didn't go to work. I just sat on the floor, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but that was worse. The final straw was the journal. By then, I had started recording everything obsessively, hoping to make sense of the madness. One night, as I flipped through its pages, I found entries I didn't remember writing. They were written in my handwriting but described things I hadn't done, like walking to the park and meeting someone named Simon. He knows, one entry read. Another said, "The gap is widening. Prepare yourself." I started avoiding mirrors entirely. I covered the windows with blankets, afraid I'd see that void again. But the strangest thing was that my reflection didn't seem to need a surface anymore. I'd catch glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, just out of reach, watching. Once, as I walked into the bathroom, I swear I saw it waiting for me, standing just inside the door. When I spun around, there was nothing there, but the chill in the air lingered long after. I don't know how much time has passed since I began noticing the changes. The days blur together, and I've stopped trusting my clocks. People still call, still text, but I don't answer. When I do pick up my phone, I find photos I didn't take, images of me sleeping, walking down the street, sitting at my desk. In some, my eyes are open, staring directly at the camera, but I don't remember being awake. I've tried to fight it, but I don't think there's anything to fight. Whatever's happening isn't coming from outside. It's me, or some version of me, peeling away the layers of who I thought I was. Sometimes I catch myself smiling for no reason, a cold, knowing grin that doesn't feel like mine. The gaps are growing longer. I can feel them swallowing me whole, piece by piece. Last night, I found a note on my pillow. It was written in my handwriting, but the phrasing felt alien, the words sharp and deliberate. It read, "You've always been the shadow. Now it's your turn to step aside." I didn't sleep after that. I don't think I ever will again. The first time I noticed something was off, I was on my way to work, standing at the corner of Elm and 3rd. The crosswalk light turned green, and the usual stream of people moved with me across the street. Halfway through, I glanced up and froze. Across the intersection, there was a man in a red jacket, standing utterly still. Not unusual, except that I had just walked past him seconds before. Same red jacket, same dark eyes, same weary stance as if the morning air was too heavy to bear. I whipped around, trying to locate where the original man had gone, but there was no sign of him. The crowd pushed me forward, muttering curses as I stumbled to the curb. I laughed it off, a weird coincidence, nothing more. People look alike all the time, don't they? The next incident was less ignorable. I was scrolling through emails during lunch when I saw one from a name I didn't recognize, Jonas. The subject line read, "Update. All clear." Curious, I opened it, but the body was blank, just a timestamp and nothing more. I stared at it for a while, debating whether to delete it. Before I could decide, a notification flashed, email deleted. My hands weren't on the keyboard. I checked the trash folder, empty. Even though the office buzzed with conversation and clicking keyboards around me, everything suddenly felt hollow, like I was sitting in a set that only looked like my workplace. The feeling faded by the time I left for home, but an itch remained, just under my skin. From then on, the world seemed to lean at odd angles, subtle enough that I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment things tipped, only that they had. I'd hear snippets of conversations that felt ripped from another life. People I didn't know calling me by name, asking about things I didn't remember doing. "Hey, did you ever finish that painting?" a barista asked me once. I've never painted a thing in my life. I laughed it off, but she looked at me like I was joking. "Come on, you're messing with me," she said. Her tone was casual, but her eyes were searching. When I insisted I didn't know what she meant, she stopped smiling. After that, the changes became bolder. My apartment rearranged itself one night while I slept. I woke to find my bed pushed against the opposite wall and my bookshelf rotated 90 degrees. I hadn't heard a thing. A pair of unfamiliar boots sat by the door, scuffed, worn, and definitely not mine. I sat down to write it all out, hoping to piece together the timeline, but the more I wrote, the less coherent it seemed. Some details slipped through my grasp even as I wrote them, and I'd have to stop to ask myself, did that actually happen? Every time I reread the notes, they looked different somehow, as though the words rearranged themselves the moment I looked away. I started testing the limits of the changes. I left a banana on the kitchen counter, placed dead center, and drew a circle around it with chalk. The next morning, the banana was gone, and a single orange had taken its place. The chalk circle was smudged, almost erased, but not entirely. I checked the trash, the fridge, even my pockets. Nothing. The banana wasn't just missing. It had been swapped. One night, I left the television on while I dozed on the couch. I woke up to the news playing, except it wasn't the news. At least, not my news. The anchorwoman talked about a country I'd never heard of. Its name too guttural and alien to stick in my memory. When I tried to record it on my phone, the video came out blank, just static and flickers of light. That was when I started to feel watched, like the walls were thinner than they should be, like I was a fish in a bowl. The real breaking point came at the grocery store. I walked down an aisle for some cereal, and a woman's laughter rang out from somewhere near the milk coolers. It was familiar in the worst way, a sound I knew from a dream I couldn't place. I turned to see her, tall, red scarf, leaning against her cart, and she waved at me. "Hey, you're late," she said brightly, as if we were old friends. I didn't know what to say. My body moved like I'd been trained for this exact moment. "Sorry, I got held up," I heard myself reply, but the words felt wrong, like someone else was speaking through me. Her smile wavered. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone more careful now. I stared at her for too long before I blurted, "Do I know you?" The look she gave me then was something I'll never forget. Pity and terror tangled together. She didn't say anything else. She just walked away, her cart rattling too loudly in the dead silence of the aisle. When I got home, the boots by the door were gone, but now there was a red scarf draped over the back of a chair. I sat down and stared at it for a long time. I didn't touch it. I just waited, as if waiting would solve something, as if it would give me answers. Now, I'm not sure how much time has passed. The days bleed together. I no longer recognize most of the people around me, but they seem to know me well enough. I keep catching glimpses of Jonas, the man in the red jacket, but he never says a word. Sometimes he's just a flicker at the edge of my vision. Sometimes, when I dream, he's there, standing at a distance, always watching. This morning, I found a note taped to my mirror. It wasn't my handwriting, but it felt familiar, like the loop of a melody you almost remember. It said, "You're slipping through." I stared at my reflection for a long time after that, waiting for it to do something I couldn't. It was the kind of evening that lulled you into a false sense of security. The sky was a deep navy, stars just beginning to peek through, and the air carried the clean, earthy smell of a recent rain. I was driving home after visiting a friend in the next town over, taking the back roads like I always did. They were faster, quieter, and usually relaxing. That night, though, something was different. I was about 10 miles out from my house when I first noticed it. The pair of headlights in my rearview mirror had been following me for a while, not unusual on a long, empty road. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized they were keeping pace with me, matching my every move. If I sped up, they sped up. If I slowed down, they did too. It wasn't aggressive, not tailgating or trying to pass, but there was a strange patience to it, like whoever was driving had all the time in the world. I told myself I was imagining things. People drive the same route all the time. They probably lived nearby or were heading into town, just like me. But my unease grew with every mile. The road was bordered by dense trees on either side, and there were no turnoffs or streetlights, just an endless tunnel of asphalt and darkness. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel as I fought the rising tide of anxiety. About a mile later, I saw a chance to shake them. There was a dirt road coming up on my right, one I'd taken before as a shortcut. I flicked on my turn signal and made the turn, glancing in my rearview mirror to see if they'd keep going. They didn't. The headlights followed me, sharp and deliberate. The dirt road was rough and uneven, kicking up a cloud of dust behind me. I pushed my car harder than I should have, my tires slipping on the gravel. I didn't care. I just wanted to lose them. The headlights stayed stubbornly close, a predatory gleam in the dark. My breath came faster, my heart pounding in my chest. Ahead, the dirt road curved sharply to the left, disappearing into the trees. I knew there was a clearing just beyond it, a spot where I could turn around or at least get a better sense of what was happening. I made the turn at the last second, my tires skidding, and slammed on the brakes as I reached the clearing. Dust billowed around me, obscuring the headlights for a moment. I sat there, gripping the wheel, waiting to see if they'd follow. They didn't. The car stopped just before the curve, its headlights pointed straight ahead, illuminating the tree line. It just sat there, engine idling. I couldn't see the driver through the haze of dust and shadows, but I could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. They were watching me, waiting for something. I thought about reversing, but the narrow road meant I'd have to maneuver carefully, and I didn't trust myself to keep my composure. My phone was on the passenger seat, but there was no signal out here. I was completely alone. The car started to inch forward, its headlights cutting through the dust. My instincts screamed at me to move. I jammed the car into gear and sped off down the dirt road, the clearing shrinking in my rearview mirror. The headlights swung sharply to follow, closer now, almost on top of me. I could hear their tires crunching on the gravel. Relentless chase. Then, without warning, the road split in two. I hadn't been down this way in years and didn't remember the fork. One path veered left, narrower and overgrown, while the other continued straight into the unknown. I didn't have time to think. I took the left turn, my car bouncing violently over roots and potholes. Branches scraped against the sides, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. The headlights hesitated for a moment before following, slower this time, as if they were trying to figure out my next move. I kept going until the road became nearly impassable. My car shuddered to a stop, the engine straining against the uneven terrain. I killed the lights and held my breath, my entire body trembling. The other car crept closer, its headlights sweeping through the trees, casting long, distorted shadows. Then it stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the ticking of my cooling engine and the faint hum of their idling car. I felt trapped, like prey cornered by a predator. My hands itched to do something. Honk the horn, flash the lights, anything. But I stayed frozen, waiting. Then the lights went out. The road plunged into darkness, and I felt the kind of fear that claws at your throat, primal and unrelenting. I could hear movement now, faint and deliberate, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Someone was coming. I reached for my phone again, desperate, hoping for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I locked the doors and pressed myself against the seat, as if that would make me invisible. The footsteps stopped just outside my window. I didn't dare look. A soft tapping broke the silence. Not a knock, but the sound of a finger trailing along the glass, slow and deliberate. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the night. A moment later, the car roared back to life, its headlights snapping on. It reversed down the path, the red glow of its taillights disappearing around the bend. I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. When I finally mustered the courage to turn the car around and head back, I kept my lights off, creeping slowly, half expecting to see them waiting at the fork. But the road was empty. To this day, I don't know who was in that car or what they wanted. I've told myself it was probably a prank or some weirdo looking to scare me, but the way they moved, the deliberate patience, it didn't feel like a game. I avoid that road now, but sometimes, late at night, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again, glowing like hungry eyes in the dark. The first thing I noticed was the sound, deep, resonant, like the hum of a cello string plucked just once but stretching endlessly in the air. It wasn't loud, but it filled every space, even the parts of me that shouldn't have been able to hear. I was in my car, stalled at the edge of a two-lane highway surrounded by farmland. The stretch of road ahead was shrouded in mist, a dense wall of gray that seemed too deliberate to be natural. My GPS had abandoned me miles ago, and my phone's battery had given up shortly after. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:07 a.m. Why hadn't I turned around hours ago? I wanted to say it was stubbornness, the refusal to admit I'd made a mistake. But there was something else, something unspoken, that urged me forward. The hum grew louder, but when I stepped out of the car, it vanished completely, as if the night had swallowed it whole. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp and metallic, carrying a faint scent of something burning, though there was no smoke to be seen. I looked around, trying to piece together some semblance of a direction, but everything felt off-kilter, like the world had tilted just a few degrees when I wasn't looking. That's when I saw the lights. They weren't headlights, and they weren't the warm, yellow glow of farmhouse windows. They flickered just above the horizon, a pale green pulse, like fireflies suspended in water. Against my better judgment, or perhaps because I had so little of it left, I began walking toward them. The road beneath my feet felt strange, softer than asphalt but firm enough to hold my weight. The mist parted in lazy swirls as I moved, revealing more of the flickering lights. I couldn't tell how far I had walked when I saw the first one. A house, if you could call it that. It stood alone in the field, its outline jagged and uneven, as if it had been built without a single right angle. The walls seemed to shift and breathe in the fog, and the windows were completely dark, absorbing what little light the night offered. The green pulse came from somewhere behind it, and I knew, without understanding why, that I had to go inside. The front door wasn't locked. It opened with a low groan, revealing a hallway that stretched farther than the house's dimensions should have allowed. The walls were lined with mirrors, all cracked, the shards held in place by something thicker than glue. My reflection was fractured, splintered into a dozen pieces that didn't quite align. As I stepped inside, the door closed softly behind me, though I hadn't touched it. The air here was warmer, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of warmth that pressed too close, making it hard to breathe. The hum returned, faint but insistent, pulling me deeper into the house. The hallway twisted and turned, leading me past rooms that shouldn't have been there. Rooms with ceilings too high or walls that leaned inward, as though the house was folding in on itself. I saw glimpses of things inside those rooms. A table set for dinner with plates that were too large, chairs that seemed to sag under their own weight. A staircase that spiraled upward into nothingness. A pool of water so still it reflected the ceiling perfectly, though there was nothing on the ceiling to reflect. Then there were the sounds. Faint whispers, like a conversation just out of reach. They weren't words I could understand, more like the suggestion of language, rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the hum. At the end of the hallway stood another door, this one smaller, barely taller than my shoulders. Its wood was pale and unvarnished, etched with symbols I didn't recognize but somehow knew I shouldn't touch. The hum was louder here, almost unbearable, and I hesitated before reaching for the handle. The door opened before I could make up my mind, and what I saw on the other side was wrong. Not in the way people describe bad food or poorly made furniture. This was a deeper wrong, the kind that made my stomach twist and my chest tighten. The room was empty, but it wasn't. It had walls, but they stretched into a horizon that shouldn't have existed. The floor was solid, but it rippled like water when I stepped inside. And the light, oh, the light. It wasn't green anymore. It was colorless, a brightness that seared my vision yet left no afterimage when I blinked. In the center of the room stood a figure, neither man nor woman, its form shimmering like heat waves rising off asphalt. It had no face, just a smooth expanse where one should have been, but I felt its gaze all the same. My feet refused to move, as though the floor had solidified beneath me, trapping me in place. It reached out, its hand, or what I assumed was a hand, extending toward me with a slowness that made every second stretch into infinity. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, but my body wouldn't obey. When it touched me, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, an absence of sound, so complete it felt like my ears might implode. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw myself standing where the figure had been, my face smooth and featureless. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked on the side of the highway. The mist was gone, replaced by a pre-dawn sky streaked with orange and pink. My phone sat on the passenger seat, fully charged, though I knew for a fact the battery had died. The clock read 7:13 a.m., and the road ahead was clear. I drove without stopping, without thinking, until I reached the nearest town. The gas station attendant gave me a strange look when I asked where I was. He said the name of a place I didn't recognize, hundreds of miles from where I'd been the night before. To this day, I can't explain what happened or how I got there. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I hear it again, that low, resonant hum. And I know, wherever it came from, it's still waiting for me. I was walking home from work one night when I noticed the streetlight near the corner of Birch and 8th flickering erratically. I'd seen it before, an aging bulb, probably. I didn't give it much thought. It was late, the sky a deep bruise of indigo and black, and the city's quiet hum felt almost comforting. But as I approached the light, I realized something was different. The air under it shimmered faintly, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. It wasn't warm, though. If anything, the temperature had dropped. I stepped through the glow, glancing up, expecting nothing more than a short-circuiting bulb. But the moment I moved past it, everything went still. The sound of distant traffic, the rustle of leaves in the trees, it all stopped. Even my own footsteps. I turned back, my heart beginning to race. But the street behind me looked normal. A parked car, a row of brownstones, shadows stretching long in the dim light. Nothing out of place. Except there was no sound. Not a single thing. I clapped my hands together, but the action felt muted, like slapping my palms against a pillow. Panic surged, but before I could process it, the light behind me blinked once, and sound rushed back. The world snapped into motion. Cars, distant voices, the whisper of wind. Everything was normal again. Or so I thought. The next morning, I was brushing my teeth when I noticed my reflection didn't quite match my movements. Not by much, just a fraction of a second. I tested it, tilting my head left, then right. It followed, perfectly in sync this time. Maybe I'd imagined it. I was tired. Work had been stressful. But when I opened the medicine cabinet to grab some painkillers, I froze. The bottle wasn't there. I always kept it on the middle shelf, next to the mouthwash. My hands fumbled through the jumble of toiletries, but it was gone. I was halfway through convincing myself I must have moved it when I spotted it on the bathroom counter. Right there, plain as day. I didn't put it there. I knew I hadn't. It wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next week, objects began shifting, not disappearing but relocating subtly, quietly, without explanation. My wallet, always on the kitchen counter, would appear in my coat pocket. A pair of shoes I'd left in the closet were suddenly by the front door. At first, I assumed I was just stressed and forgetful, but the frequency of these events escalated, and I started paying closer attention. Then there were the neighbors. I didn't know them well, just faces I'd nod to in passing. But they'd started acting wrong. Mrs. Carter, who always wore her hair pinned back in an elegant bun, had it loose and wild one day, the same way her teenage granddaughter wore hers. She smiled and said hello, but her voice was an octave higher, almost childlike. Then there was Mr. Avery. He waved at me as usual, but his wave was too mechanical, too perfect. It was as if someone had studied him carefully and then tried to imitate him without understanding the subtleties of human behavior. The worst was when I saw the same person twice in one place. It happened at the bus stop. A man in a red hoodie was standing by the bench, scrolling through his phone. I didn't think much of it until I turned the corner and saw him again, standing by the crosswalk, in the exact same pose, scrolling in the same way. I glanced back toward the bench. He was still there. Two identical figures, 50 feet apart, performing the same action like puppets on a string. The incident snowballed. A bird landed on the railing outside my apartment window every morning at 7:12 a.m., chirping the same sequence of notes. A car with a dented fender parked outside the cafe I frequented, then again outside the pharmacy, then again outside my office, all within the same hour. My phone started displaying notifications that disappeared the moment I tried to open them, replaced with gibberish symbols. One night, I tried writing it all down. Everything I'd seen, every strange thing I'd noticed. But no matter how much I wrote, the words never made sense when I read them back. It was as though the act of documenting the strangeness itself corrupted it. The ink seemed to blur on the page, not all at once but slowly, like watching frost creep over glass. By the time I noticed the people on the street resetting, walking the same stretch, performing the same gestures, saying the same lines of conversation, I couldn't deny what was happening. Reality wasn't stable. I wasn't sure if it was breaking, or if I was the one breaking it. The thought that maybe I was the anomaly, the rogue piece of a larger design, gnawed at me. Was I malfunctioning, or was I seeing too much? One night, I decided to push back. I walked against the flow of the loop. If a man passed me, I turned and followed him instead. If a door was supposed to close, I held it open. It was subtle at first, small ripples, nothing more. But as I continued, reality seemed to struggle to accommodate me. Shadows flickered unnaturally, like frames missing in a poorly rendered animation. A building across the street briefly lost its texture, becoming a flat plane of color before snapping back into place. And then, it all stopped. I found myself standing in an empty, featureless void. Not black, not white, just nothing. A figure appeared, featureless and translucent, like a human-shaped shard of glass. It spoke without words, its voice an idea in my mind rather than a sound. "Why do you notice?" it asked. I didn't know how to respond. The question itself felt absurd. "What is this?" I managed to say. It tilted its head, or maybe it didn't. Its form was hard to follow, as though it existed in several places at once. "You're not supposed to. That's all." Before I could ask what it meant, the void collapsed, and I was standing back in my apartment, the clock ticking softly on the wall. The objects were where they should be. The neighbors acted normal. The routines of life resumed as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't unknow the fragility of the world around me. And I couldn't stop wondering what would happen if I kept noticing. It began with a voicemail. Nothing dramatic, just a small interruption in an otherwise unremarkable week. I was sitting in my car on my lunch break, scrolling through memes and half-heartedly picking at a turkey sandwich when my phone buzzed with the missed call. No caller ID. That wasn't unusual. Telemarketers were practically an epidemic. But the voicemail was strange. 30 seconds of silence, except it wasn't entirely silent. There was this faint static, layered with a distant, rhythmic clicking, almost like someone gently tapping a microphone, or maybe the hollow, wet sound of water dripping onto a tin surface. I deleted it without much thought. Later that night, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone again when I saw it. The voicemail notification was back. No missed call this time, just the same message. Same timestamp. The logical part of my brain told me it was a glitch, so I deleted it again, shrugged it off, and went asleep. The next day, it came back. This time, I didn't delete it right away. Something about it nagged at me. Maybe it was the way the clicks seemed intentional. They weren't random, like water or static. They were spaced out in irregular intervals. I started counting, matching each click to a number in my head. 7, 4, 2, 7 again, then 3. It almost felt like a code. I wasn't sure why that thought unsettled me, but it did. I tried blocking the number, a pointless exercise given there wasn't one, and I finally called my carrier, asking if they could trace the origin of the messages. The rep was polite, if a little confused. She assured me the voicemail system hadn't logged any incoming calls to my account, much less repeated ones. When I pressed her further, she fell silent for a moment before quietly suggesting I reset my phone. That night, I reset it. It didn't help. For a while, I stopped listening to the messages. I didn't delete them, but I didn't play them either. It was easier to pretend they weren't there. Except they started to change. They grew shorter, more clipped, and what once sounded like random clicks began to sound like syllables, like someone trying to speak through broken static. A word would almost form, HSSS, TTA, then it would collapse into that relentless clicking. I didn't sleep much after that. The worst part wasn't the messages themselves. It was the fact that they knew. Somehow they knew. My phone would buzz while I was in the shower, while I was driving, while I was on the phone with a coworker, and each time it did, it was like I could feel the static buzzing just beneath my skin. Watching. Waiting. One night, around 2 in the morning, I made a mistake. I played the message on speaker. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe I thought hearing it out loud would make it seem less unnerving. But this time, it wasn't clicks or syllables. It was breathing. Deep, guttural, almost animalistic breaths, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other end wanted me to hear them. My stomach twisted when I realized it was too close, too loud. The kind of sound that didn't belong in a voicemail. The kind of sound that felt like it was happening in real time. I hung up on nothing and immediately threw my phone across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, the screen going dark. I didn't pick it up until morning. When I finally turned it back on, the first thing I saw was the voicemail notification. I tried not to cry. The final straw came a few nights later. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my phone turned off and shoved into a drawer. The faint hum of my fan was the only sound in the room. I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the feeling of something wrong. My ears were ringing, and my skin felt damp with sweat. My first thought was that the power had gone out, because the fan had stopped. But then I noticed the sound, a faint, rhythmic clicking, coming from somewhere in the room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My eyes darted toward the corner of the room, where the shadows pooled thick and heavy against the wall. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the clicking stopped, and in its place came that same breathing, deep and deliberate, as if someone was standing just out of view. The closet door creaked open. I wish I could say I screamed, or that I bolted out of the room, but I didn't. I just froze, my mind blank with the kind of primal terror that makes you feel like prey. A single thought rattled through my head, unbidden. It's been inside all along. The breathing grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right beside my bed. My body screamed at me to run, but my limbs wouldn't cooperate. I was a prisoner in my own flesh, forced to listen as something leaned over me, exhaling warm, fetid air onto my face. And then it spoke. 3 words, rasped out through static and clicks, clear enough to make my blood run cold. Found. You. Now. The next thing I remember is waking up on the floor, the room bathed in early morning light. My phone was sitting on my nightstand, perfectly intact. No messages, no missed calls. Nothing to suggest anything had happened. I moved out of that apartment the same day. I bought a new phone and changed my number. I don't check my voicemail anymore, no matter how persistent the notifications are. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the fan hums softly, I hear it again. That faint, rhythmic clicking. I don't look at the shadows. I don't want to know what's waiting in them.